I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was hidden at the end of a dirt trail that stretched 2 miles off the main road, almost swallowed up by pine trees that leaned over it like heavy curtains. The air smelled sharp with resin, and the silence felt thicker than anything I was used to. I had rented it for a week, thinking it would be a good place to clear my head. I had been working long hours staring at screens surrounded by noise from the city. I thought isolation would be a relief. I thought being alone would be peaceful. The cabin itself was small, with dark wood panels weathered by rain and time. The windows were dusty, and the front steps sagged when I walked on them. The roofline was crooked, but it held. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in months. It had one room downstairs with a fireplace, a kitchen tucked into the corner, and a narrow staircase that led up to a small loft where the bed was. It looked rough but livable. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. Nothing fancy, just quiet and space. That first day passed uneventfully. I unloaded my backpack, lit a fire in the stove to chase the dampness out of the walls, and walked around the property. The trees stretched in every direction, thick enough that I couldn't see far. There was no cell service, no noise but wind through the branches. I tried to breathe it in like medicine. That night I fell asleep listening to the crackle of the fire, thinking I would finally get the rest I needed. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something. I had woken up around 2 in the morning, needing to use the bathroom. The loft window was small, but when I glanced toward it, I noticed a faint light outside, like the dull glow of a lantern or a flashlight. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The light was moving, swaying, weaving between the trees. It wasn't strong, it looked far away, maybe 100 yards out, but it was definitely there. I stayed frozen in bed for a long time, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone camping nearby, but my chest felt tight. I hadn't seen any sign of people during the day. The trail to the cabin was so narrow I couldn't imagine anyone stumbling on it by accident. I didn't go back to sleep after that. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the loft ceiling, waiting for the light to come back. It didn't. When morning finally came, I told myself I had been half asleep, maybe imagining it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. On the third night, I heard footsteps. They came just after midnight, soft at first, like something pressing lightly into the ground. The cabin walls were thin, and the silence outside carried every sound. I lay in bed with my heart pounding, listening. The steps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dead pine needles scattered across the ground. They stopped sometimes, then started again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened as someone or something made a slow loop around the walls. Then the sound faded into the distance, swallowed up by the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. There were marks in the dirt, faint impressions where someone had stepped. The ground was dry, but I could see the outline of boots. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been there. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and hiking back to the road, but I told myself I was overreacting. People wandered through woods all the time. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe whoever it was had seen smoke from the chimney and wanted to look. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside in the dark, circling me while I tried to sleep. The fourth day felt heavier. I couldn't relax. Every sound of the forest made me snap my head around. The creak of the trees in the wind sounded like footsteps. The brush of a bird's wing startled me. By the time the sun set, I had already shoved a chair under the doorknob and pushed the small dresser in front of it. I sat up late, staring at the dark window, listening. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. But this time, they didn't circle. They came straight to the door. I held my breath, staring down from the loft. The sound stopped right at the steps. Then the boards groaned, as if someone was testing their weight on them. I felt my skin crawl. I waited, gripping the edge of the bed so hard my fingers ached. The boards creaked again, then silence. For hours I didn't move. I didn't even blink. When dawn finally came, I got up and checked the steps. The dirt at the bottom of the stairs was disturbed, like someone had stood there for a long time. That day I made a plan to leave. But when I went to grab my backpack, I realized something was wrong. I always kept it by the front door, leaning against the wall. But it wasn't there. I looked around the cabin, checked the loft, the kitchen, even outside. Nothing, it was gone. All my food, my water bottles, my map, everything was inside that pack. I knew I hadn't moved it. Someone had come inside while I slept. The thought made my stomach twist. I sat on the bed, trying to steady myself. I felt cornered. I was miles from the road with no supplies, no way to call for help. Whoever had been out there wasn't just wandering anymore. They had come inside. That night was the worst. I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, trying to stay quiet. Every nerve stretched thin. My ears rang with silence, and I kept thinking I heard breathing. At some point, I smelled something faint, like cigarette smoke drifting in through the cracks of the cabin walls. I didn't move. I just sat there staring into the blackness until my eyes burned. Then came the sound of the back door latch rattling. It was soft, careful, like someone was testing it. The wood creaked, but I had locked it. After a while, the sound stopped. Then footsteps moved along the side of the cabin. I stayed awake until the sky turned pale. When morning finally came, I opened the door and stepped outside, my legs weak and shaky. The forest looked calm, but the ground told a different story. There were footprints everywhere around the cabin, pressed into the dirt in messy, overlapping patterns. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I gathered what little I had left. A flashlight, a jacket, a half-empty bottle of water I had left upstairs. I told myself I could make it to the road if I started early. The path was narrow, but I remembered the way. The first hour was fine. The woods were quiet, the sun filtering through the branches. I tried to keep a steady pace, but every time I looked behind me, I thought I saw movement. Shadows slipping between trees, branches shifting where nothing should be. I told myself it was just nerves, but then I saw it. About 50 yards back, half hidden by the trees, someone was standing there. A figure in dark clothes, tall, not moving. I froze, my mouth dry. For a moment I thought maybe I was seeing things, but when I blinked they were still there, just watching me. I forced myself to move faster. I didn't run, but I walked as quickly as I could, my boots crunching on the trail. Every few minutes I glanced back. Sometimes I saw nothing. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of that figure, still following, never closer, never farther. The trail felt endless. My throat burned with thirst and my legs ached. Hours passed, but the road didn't appear. Panic started to claw at me. Had I taken a wrong turn? The woods all looked the same. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a small clearing. I recognized it. It was the same clearing near the cabin where I had gathered firewood the first day. Somehow I had walked in a circle. My stomach dropped. I felt dizzy, like the trees were closing in, and then I smelled smoke. I turned, and through the trees I saw it. Thin threads of smoke rising into the sky. The cabin. Somehow I had ended up right back where I started. I didn't want to go inside, but the sun was sinking and the woods were thick with shadows. I felt trapped. I stumbled up the steps, shoved the door shut, and collapsed against the wall. My hands were shaking. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the loft with the flashlight in my hand, waiting. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the creak of the cabin settling. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had lost them. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard the door creak. Not the latch this time. The door. It opened slow, the hinges whining. I gripped the flashlight, my chest tight. I aimed it toward the stairs, waiting for something to move. For a long time, there was nothing. Just silence. Then I heard the sound of breathing. It was faint but steady just below me at the foot of the loft stairs. My whole body went cold. I didn't move. I didn't dare shine the light. I sat frozen, listening as that slow, calm breathing filled the room. It went on for what felt like hours. Then without a sound it stopped. I didn't sleep. I didn't move until sunlight filtered through the window. When I finally crept down the stairs, the cabin was empty. The door was shut. But on the table in the center of the room sat my missing backpack. I didn't touch it. I didn't even open it. I just stared at it, knowing that someone had carried it back inside while I sat awake above them. That was when I knew I couldn't stay another second. I left everything behind. I didn't care about supplies. I didn't care about the trail. I just picked a direction away from the cabin and started walking. I pushed through brush, stumbled over roots, scraped my arms on branches. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked until my legs free. I had been driving for hours before the gravel road finally narrowed into a single lane that wound its way through the forest. My arms were sore from gripping the wheel too tightly. The sun was dipping lower behind the trees, casting shadows across the dirt, and every time I thought I had gone far enough, the road stretched on further. The air grew heavier with the smell of pine and damp soil, and the deeper I drove, the more I felt like I was being swallowed whole by the woods. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old coworker who let me use it for a week after I told him I wanted a place away from everything. He warned me it was remote, said cell service would be spotty and groceries were 30 miles back the way I had come. But that was exactly what I wanted. I had stocked the trunk with canned food, bottled water, some basic tools, a hunting knife, and enough firewood strapped to the roof to keep me warm for a few nights if the propane heater didn't work. By the time I finally spotted the roof of the cabin through the trees, the sky was bleeding orange and red. The place was smaller than I expected, made of dark logs that looked worn down by years of weather. The windows were streaked with dust and the porch sagged in the middle as if it carried too much weight for too long. The trees stood so close around it that they blocked most of the remaining light, and even with the engine still running, I felt a strange stillness press against me as I parked. I cut the engine and listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of branches creaking. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels alive. I forced myself to grab my bags and push open the cabin door. The hinges moaned and the smell hit me. Old wood, mildew, and something faintly sour, like damp cloth that never dried. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single main room with a small kitchenette on one side, a cot against the far wall, and a narrow hallway that led to what I guessed was the bathroom and maybe a storage room. Dust clung to everything. Spiderwebs stretched across the corners, and I noticed scratch marks on the floorboards, though I told myself it was just from moving furniture over the years. I lit a lantern since the overhead light didn't come on when I flipped the switch. The yellow glow gave the place a sickly warmth, but at least it pushed the shadows back a little. I unpacked slowly, listening to every small sound the wood made beneath my boots. The first night passed quietly. I cooked a can of beans on the little propane stove, ate in silence, and then tried to sleep on the cot. The mattress sagged, and every time I shifted, the springs groaned. I didn't sleep much. Every creak, every shift of the cabin as it cooled made me think someone was walking just outside the door. The next morning I went outside to get a better look at the area. The forest pressed tight on all sides, but a faint trail cut through the brush behind the cabin. The ground was soft from rain and I saw deer prints leading down the path. For a while I walked it, just to stretch my legs. After maybe 15 minutes, I found a rusted fence half buried in leaves and broken branches. Beyond it, the forest grew thicker, darker, like it had been left untouched for decades. Something about the stillness there unsettled me, so I turned back. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. I had just settled in, lantern glowing dim, when I heard it, a thud outside. Not a branch falling, not the wind, but something solid hitting the porch. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the silence closed in again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or stray dog, and forced myself to lie back down. But my eyes kept flicking to the door, waiting. Hours passed like that. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it again, this time against the wall near the window. A dragging sound followed, slow and deliberate, as if something heavy brushed along the logs. My skin crawled. I didn't sleep at all after that. At dawn, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing was there. No tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing to show what I had heard. But the porch rail was damp, and when I touched it, my fingers came back sticky as if someone had smeared something across the wood during the night. That day, I busied myself with chores. I split some of the firewood, cleaned the cabin as best I could, and checked the propane tanks. The whole time, though, I felt watched. Every time I glanced into the trees, I swore I saw movement. A flash of color, the sway of a branch that didn't match the wind. By the third night, my nerves were shot. I built a fire in the small stone pit outside before the sun went down, hoping the light would make me feel safer. I sat out there with the lantern beside me, listening. The fire popped and hissed, and the smoke curled into the dark sky. For a while, nothing happened. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. They weren't heavy, but they were too controlled to be an animal. Slow, careful, circling just beyond the firelight. My throat tightened. I stayed frozen, every muscle stiff, listening to the crunch of leaves just out of sight. The footsteps stopped whenever I turned my head too quickly, as if whoever it was knew I was straining to catch them. When the fire burned low, I couldn't stand it anymore. I threw dirt over the embers and went inside, locking the door and wedging a chair beneath the handle. The sound didn't follow me in, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing just out there, watching. The next morning, I checked the ground. Sure enough, there were faint impressions in the dirt, shoe prints, not animal tracks. They circled the cabin and stopped at the window. My stomach dropped when I saw the smudge on the glass, like someone had pressed their face against it to look in. I thought about leaving right then, but the road was long and I hated the idea of driving that trail at night if I didn't make it back before sunset. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. One more night, that was the mistake. That night, the noises came earlier. Scraping on the walls, footsteps on the porch, the soft creak of wood shifting under weight. My lantern flickered as if the fuel was low, though I had just filled it. I sat in the corner with the hunting knife clutched tight in my hand, heart hammering against my ribs. At some point, I must have drifted off to spite myself, because I woke to the sound of the door rattling. The chair I had wedged beneath the handle shook against the floor. My mouth went dry. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The rattling stopped, followed by a long silence. Then I heard the window slide. It squealed against the frame and cold air seeped in. That was when I ran. I grabbed my bag, shoved the lantern into it, and bolted out the back door. The forest swallowed me instantly, branches whipping my face as I stumbled down the trail. I didn't look back, didn't dare. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would tear open. Eventually, I dropped behind a fallen tree and forced myself to be still. My ears strained for movement, and soon enough I heard it. The sound of someone walking the same trail, slower now, careful, as if they knew I was just ahead. I stayed hidden until dawn. Only when the light broke through the branches did I creep back toward the road, keeping low, my knife still in my hand. When I reached my car, the driver's side door was open. My stomach turned cold. I hadn't left it like that. The seats were wet, as if someone had sat there with damp clothes waiting. The glove compartment was open, and the papers inside were scattered across the floor. Whoever it was had been inside going through everything. I didn't care. I threw my bag in, slammed the door, and started the engine. The tires spat gravel as I tore down the road without looking back. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. By the time I reached the highway, the morning sun felt too bright, too unreal. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for nearly an hour, trying to steady my breathing. I never went back for my things at the cabin. I never even called my co-worker to explain why I left it that way. The thought of trying to explain what happened made my skin crawl. To this day, I don't know who it was out there watching me, circling the cabin, trying to get inside. But I know it wasn't my imagination. I saw the footprints. I saw the smudges on the glass. And I know that if I had stayed one more night or hesitated when the window opened, I might not have left at all. I had been planning to take a break away from everything for months. Work had been eating me alive, and the constant noise of the city made it impossible to breathe properly. A co-worker told me about a small cabin his cousin used to own, far up in the hills next to a half-dry lake. He said no one really went up there anymore, and that it was the perfect place to shut the world out for a while. The way he described it made it sound peaceful. Almost too peaceful, but I felt that was exactly what I needed. I didn't want towns. I didn't want lodges filled with strangers, and I didn't want cell service. I wanted quiet, and that cabin promised it. It was the beginning of fall when I set out. The road leading there was rough, twisting deeper into the forest until my car started to complain. Fallen leaves covered the dirt track like a blanket, and I drove slowly so I wouldn't slide off into the trees. The map I had printed showed the cabin was about 2 miles past a broken wooden sign that pointed toward an old logging trail. Sure enough, I found the sign half buried in brush, leaning as if it would collapse at the next storm. I parked near it and got out, the air cool and still. The silence struck me first. No cars, no people, not even the buzz of power lines. Only the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The cabin was not reachable by car, so I had to walk. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food, water, a camp stove, batteries, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I had also packed a small hunting knife, not because I expected trouble, but because it felt careless to go into the woods without one. The trail was narrow and partly swallowed by weeds. As I walked, I noticed faint signs of neglect: broken branches that hadn't been cleared, moss climbing over rocks, and the smell of damp earth so strong it clung to my clothes. After about half an hour, the trees thinned, and I finally saw it. The cabin sat on a slight rise, looking out over the edge of a dark, still lake. It was smaller than I expected, only one story, built from logs that had darkened over time. The roof sagged slightly, but it seemed solid. A short set of steps led up to a front porch with a railing that leaned inward as though something heavy had once pressed against it. The windows were dirty but unbroken, and the door hung crooked on its frame, yet still closed tight. For a place left alone so long, it was intact. I pushed open the door, and the smell of old wood and dust rushed out. Inside, the cabin was one room with the corner walled off for a bathroom. A stone fireplace sat against one wall, its grate stuffed with ashes that looked years old. An old table with 2 chairs rested by the window, and a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress sat against the far wall. There was no electricity, no plumbing beyond what must have been a rain barrel system outside, and no signs of anyone having been here recently. It was exactly what I wanted: bare, forgotten, and quiet. That first day I unpacked slowly, setting my food on the table and unrolling my sleeping bag on the mattress. I walked down to the lake and stood on the shore. The water was dark, still enough to reflect the trees perfectly, though a thin layer of green algae floated on its edges. I didn't hear frogs, insects, or even birds near the water. That struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. The forest itself was alive with sound, so maybe the lake was simply not a place animals liked. As night came, I lit a lantern and set it on the table. The light flickered against the walls, throwing shadows into the corners. I felt uneasy without electricity, but I reminded myself this was what I had chosen. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to be away from people. I ate a cold meal, read for a while, and finally stretched out in the sleeping bag. The forest outside was louder now, full of the movement of nocturnal animals, and the sound was both comforting and unsettling. I closed my eyes, telling myself I would sleep fine, but sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside seemed sharper in the dark. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled. Once I thought I heard something brushing against the cabin wall. I held my breath and waited, but nothing followed. After a long time, I must have drifted off, though my dreams were restless, filled with vague images of the lake and the trees pressing close around me. The second day, I tried to settle into the routine I had planned. I hiked along the trail past the cabin, exploring deeper into the woods. I found the remains of what must have been old logging equipment, rusted and broken, half buried in the ground. The air was colder here, shadows pooling under the thick trees, and I felt watched even though I knew no one was around. I kept moving, never straying too far because I didn't want to risk losing the trail back. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I cooked a small meal on the camp stove and sat by the lake until the sun dropped behind the hills. The water turned black again, the reflection of the trees vanishing as the light died. I thought about how isolated I was. No phone signal, no neighbors, no one to hear me if I yelled. It was freeing and terrifying at the same time. The cabin was mine, but the silence belonged to the woods. That night the noises were worse. Around midnight I woke to a sound on the porch. It was soft, like weight shifting on old wood. I froze, listening hard. Then came another creak. My skin prickled and I reached for the flashlight beside me. I didn't turn it on. I just gripped it tight, waiting. The sound faded after a minute, replaced by the ordinary groans of the forest. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer wandering close. Still, it took me hours to sleep again. On the third day, I noticed something odd. Near the lake, about 50 yards from the cabin, I found a spot where the ground was disturbed. The soil had been scraped away as if by hands or paws, leaving a shallow pit. Inside were bones, small ones, maybe from a rabbit or bird, broken and scattered. I knelt down, staring at them. The edges looked fresh, not weathered. Something had eaten here recently. That wasn't strange in itself. Predators left remains all the time. But the way the dirt was piled, it looked deliberate, almost like someone had tried to cover it. I walked back to the cabin quickly, telling myself it was just my imagination turning normal signs of wildlife into something sinister. The unease grew stronger each night. Always noises, sometimes scratching near the walls, sometimes heavy steps on the porch. I never caught sight of anything when I checked with the flashlight, but the sounds were too distinct to ignore. I started sleeping with the knife beside me, the blade open. I hated that I felt the need to do that. This was supposed to be my escape, but instead I was tense every moment after dark. On the fourth night, it became worse. I woke again to noises, but this time they were inside. Faint, but inside. My breath caught as I realized I had not bolted the door. Slowly, I sat up, listening hard. The sound was a shuffle, then a pause, then another shuffle. I raised the flashlight and flicked it on. The cabin was empty. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. I got up, heart pounding, and checked the door. It was shut, but not latched. I bolted it, my hands shaking. For the rest of the night, I sat against the wall with the knife in my lap, listening to silence that no longer felt empty but heavy, waiting. The next morning, I checked outside for signs. The porch had marks in the dust, scuffs that looked like shoe prints. Not boots, not clear enough to be certain, but human, not animal. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside while I slept. I thought about leaving immediately, packing up and hiking back to the car, but I hesitated. I told myself maybe it was old, maybe the marks were mine and I just hadn't noticed before. Maybe I was letting the silence get into my head, but deep down I knew better. Still, I stayed. That night I barely slept, the lantern left burning until it sputtered out. Every creak of the cabin made me grip the knife tighter. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under, but I woke to the sound of something trying the door. The bolt rattled. Slow, careful pressure. My blood went cold. I didn't move. The rattling stopped after a few seconds, followed by silence so complete it rang in my ears. I stayed awake until dawn, barely breathing. The decision was clear in the morning. I couldn't stay. I packed everything quickly, stuffing food and gear into the backpack, rolling the sleeping bag with shaking hands. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in and I saw it. On the porch, pressed into the dust, a clear print. A boot larger than mine pointing toward the door, fresh. I didn't look back again. I left the cabin and walked fast down the trail, refusing to stop, refusing to listen. The woods felt too still, as though they were holding their breath. When I reached the car, I nearly collapsed with relief. I threw the backpack inside and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced once into the trees. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement, a figure between the trunks standing still watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't slow down. I drove until the forest thinned and the road widened, not stopping until I reached the highway. I never went back. I never asked my coworker about his cousin, never spoke of the cabin again. But sometimes at night I wake thinking of the sound of the door rattling, slow and patient, and I wonder how long whoever it was had been waiting out there, watching me through the trees. I had been looking for a quiet place away from the city for weeks. The noise, the stress, the constant movement of people had worn me down. I wanted isolation, somewhere still, somewhere I could hear nothing but the sound of trees moving in the wind and maybe the crackle of a fire. I found a listing online for a small cabin deep in the woods. It looked plain, almost too plain, but it was cheap and it promised seclusion. That was all I wanted. The photos showed a single-room wooden structure, an outhouse behind it, and no other houses for miles. The dirt road leading to it looked rough, but I had a truck that could handle it. I booked it for a week. The drive out there was longer than I thought. After leaving the last paved road, I spent over 40 minutes on a winding track that looked less like a road and more like something carved out by rainwater. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and I had to slow down more than once just to avoid sliding into ruts that looked deep enough to swallow a tire. The trees grew thicker the further I went. By the time I reached the cabin, I couldn't see anything but forest in every direction. No signs of people, no power lines, no sound except birds and the occasional crack of wood shifting in the distance. The cabin was smaller in person than it looked in the photos. One door, one small window in the front and another on the side. The roof sagged a little and the wood was dark and weathered. There was a fire pit out front filled with old ashes. Behind the cabin, the outhouse leaned slightly to one side. I walked around the place slowly, getting a feel for it. The ground was uneven, soft in places where water must have collected after rain. The trees stood so close I could almost touch them from the side of the cabin. I couldn't hear the road anymore, and I realized I couldn't even tell which direction it was in. Inside, the cabin was one room, just as promised. A small bed frame with a thin mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a shelf with a few rusted pots. The window glass was scratched, cloudy, and I noticed one of them didn't lock properly. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. I set my bag down and opened the shutters to let in light, but it didn't make much difference. The place stayed dim even with daylight. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked some food, walked a bit into the woods but stayed close so I wouldn't lose the cabin, and collected some dry wood. By evening I had a small fire going in the pit, and I sat by it until the light faded. The forest grew almost too quiet after dark. The silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional snap of something in the underbrush. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons, and tried to relax. Still, when I finally went inside and lay on the mattress, I kept staring at the window. The thin glass, the flimsy lock. It wouldn't take much for someone to push it open. Sleep came in short bursts. Every little sound pulled me awake. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone, how no one would hear me if I screamed, how my phone showed no signal bars. It was the kind of thought that doesn't bother you when you feel safe, but it gnawed at me in the dark. The second day, I forced myself to do normal things. I walked further into the woods, keeping track of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I boiled water from a stream I found and cooked noodles on a small camping stove I had brought. I told myself this was what I wanted, quiet, solitude, but the feeling in my stomach didn't ease. The cabin felt wrong in some way I couldn't explain, like it had soaked up years of someone else's fear. That night, I woke to the sound of something outside. It wasn't the distant rustle of animals this time. It was close, heavy steps in the dirt, slow, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. My chest tightened. I wanted to get up to look, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the faint light from the window. Minutes passed. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps moving away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep again. I sat up with my back against the wall until dawn, gripping the small hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. When light finally came, I forced myself outside to look. The dirt near the cabin was disturbed. I bent down and saw the prints, boots, not animal tracks. Someone had walked around the cabin in the night. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone passing through. But the cabin was miles from any trail. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The third night it happened again. The same slow footsteps circling, pausing near the door, then silence. This time I didn't just sit and wait. I got up and looked through the cloudy glass. At first I saw nothing, just black trees against darker shadows. Then I noticed it, something pale between the trees, the shape of a face watching the cabin. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. When I looked again, the face was gone. The next morning I considered leaving, packing up and driving out, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe I was letting fear twist everything. I stayed, though the decision felt wrong even as I made it. That day I noticed something new. On the side of the cabin, near the window that didn't lock properly, the wood around the frame had fresh scratches. Not deep, but new, like someone had tested the frame trying to pry it. That night I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside, the hatchet next to me, every muscle tense. Hours passed. Then just past midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps. Slow. Closer this time. I gripped the hatchet, staring at the window. The handle of the door rattled once, sharp in the silence. I felt my throat close up. The handle moved again, harder, then stopped. For a long time there was nothing. Then the sound of retreating steps. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag. But when I stepped outside, something froze me in place. On the ground, drawn into the dirt with a stick, were words, "Stay inside." My hands shook as I threw my bag in the truck. The road out felt longer than the way in. Every shadow looked like someone standing there watching me go. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station miles away. I sat there in the truck, breathing hard, staring at the trees. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone the full story either. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I think about the words scratched in the dirt. Whoever was out there wasn't just wandering. They wanted me inside. They were waiting for the night I wouldn't leave. I had always thought of cabins in the woods as peaceful places. Little escapes where you could lock yourself away from noise and people, and just exist in silence for a while. When I rented the small wooden place deep in the forest that summer, I had no real plans other than to rest. The pictures online showed it surrounded by trees on all sides, a single dirt path leading up to it, and no other structures within miles. That was exactly what I wanted, a quiet, hidden retreat. The drive there took longer than expected. The last stretch of road turned into gravel and then into little more than a trail of packed dirt. It wound deeper and deeper into the trees, and my phone lost signal halfway through. I kept driving until I finally saw the cabin sitting in a small clearing. The wood looked darker than the photos, weathered from years of sun and rain. The porch sagged a little, and the single window reflected the light like a dull eye. When I got out, the forest greeted me with a heavy silence. There was no hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional bird or the rustle of leaves. The air smelled thick with pine and damp soil. The key was under a flat rock by the steps, just as the owner said it would be. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the stale air inside rushing out to meet me. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen corner, a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom, and a bathroom tucked away at the end. Dust clung to the edges of the furniture, but it looked clean enough to stay in. There was no electricity except for a small generator. No running water other than what was stored in barrels, and no connection to anything beyond the woods. I set my bags down, made a quick round of the rooms, and then stepped back outside to look around. The clearing was small. Beyond the grass and dirt around the cabin, the trees pressed in tightly, tall trunks standing shoulder to shoulder. It felt as if the forest was leaning closer, like it wanted to swallow the place whole. I walked a short distance into the trees just to test how quickly the cabin disappeared from view. It didn't take much. After only a few steps, the wooden structure was hidden behind trunks and leaves, and I had to turn back quickly to make sure I didn't lose my bearings. That first night, the quiet hit me harder than I expected. I sat on the small bed, listening to the distant creaks of the wood and the faint chirping outside. It was the kind of silence that grew heavier the longer it lasted, making the smallest sound echo louder. I slept lightly, waking at every crack or pop in the walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside on the porch, but I told myself it was just an animal. The woods were full of them. The days slipped into a routine. I spent mornings walking the paths that wound out from the clearing, afternoons reading or writing in a notebook, and evenings watching the shadows stretch across the trees. I carried a knife with me whenever I went out, more for comfort than anything else. The forest seemed endless, and it was easy to imagine getting lost forever if I took one wrong turn. On the third night, I noticed something strange. The cabin had one small window facing the woods. When I looked out just before going to bed, I thought I saw a shape between the trees. It was tall, too tall for a deer, and it wasn't moving. I stared until my eyes hurt, but the shadows didn't shift. Finally, I turned away, telling myself it was just my mind turning the branches into something else. Still, I closed the curtains tightly before lying down. The following morning, I went outside early, hoping to convince myself I had imagined it. The ground was damp from the night air, and when I circled the cabin, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not animal prints. They were human, clear in the soft dirt. The steps circled part of the cabin, stopping near the window I had looked out of. Whoever had made them had been standing there, watching. I stood frozen for a long time, listening to the forest, waiting for something to move. But there was nothing. The prints looked fresh, the edges still sharp, and I knew they hadn't been there the day before. I forced myself to follow them, but they led only a short distance into the trees before vanishing on the harder ground. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Every noise outside felt sharper, every shadow stretched longer. I locked the door, though the flimsy wood wouldn't have kept anyone out if they wanted in. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, knife close at hand, listening. Hours crawled by. The generator had been shut off to save fuel, so the cabin was swallowed in darkness. Then, close to midnight, I heard it. The sound of wood creaking under weight. Slow, careful steps on the porch. My chest tightened. Breath caught in my throat. The steps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. My hand clutched the knife, but I didn't breathe. For what felt like forever, there was nothing but silence. Then the faint sound of fingers brushing the door, sliding slowly across the wood. A test, almost. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, every muscle locked, waiting for the handle to turn. It never did. After a long time, the steps faded, and the night was silent again. When the first light came through the curtains, I went to the door. My hand shook as I unlatched it. The porch was empty, but the dirt in front showed new footprints. They came right up to the door and turned back. I thought about leaving right then, packing my things and driving out. But part of me wanted to believe it was some hunter or hiker who had lost their way, someone who stumbled onto the cabin by accident. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had come back deliberately. The following day, I tried to distract myself by walking farther into the woods than before. The air grew cooler under the thick canopy, and the ground was soft with layers of fallen needles. At some point, I found an old fire pit, long abandoned, surrounded by stones blackened with soot. There were beer cans crushed in the dirt, scraps of trash scattered around. Whoever had been there hadn't been gone for too long. I didn't like that. It meant people did come out here, and they didn't always leave right away. By the time I got back, the sun was dropping low. I checked around the cabin again, and my stomach dropped when I saw more footprints. This time they circled the building twice. I couldn't tell if it had happened while I was gone or earlier, but it made me feel like I was being watched even when I thought I was alone. That night was worse. I sat up in the dark, knife still in hand, every nerve pulled tight. The sounds came again. Footsteps on the porch, the brush of fingers on the window glass. Whoever it was, they were patient. They didn't try to break in, didn't speak, didn't leave signs other than the prints. They were letting me know they were there, and they knew I was inside. By the fifth day, I was barely holding it together. My food supply was running low, and I kept thinking about the long drive out on that narrow dirt road. If someone was following me, they could easily block it, or worse. I considered leaving on foot, but the forest was too deep and confusing. That evening, I made a choice. I set the knife on the table, filled a bag with the little I had, and decided I would leave at first light. But the night stretched long before me, and I knew they would come back again. Around midnight, I heard the steps, slow, steady, circling the cabin. I held my breath, waiting. Then a new sound came, the metallic scrape of something at the back window. Not fingers this time, something sharper. I realized they were trying to pry it open. My body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed the knife and pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering. The sound stopped. Silence pressed in. I waited, every second stretching longer. Then came the faintest whisper of movement inside the walls, as if someone had touched the glass and left. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I stepped outside and saw the marks. Scratches along the wood by the window frame, clear and deliberate. They hadn't managed to get in, but they had tried. That was enough for me. I packed fast, barely eating, and loaded everything into the car. The drive out felt endless. Every bend in the road I expected to see a vehicle blocking the way, or someone standing in the middle. But the forest stayed still, only the quiet pressing closer. When I finally reached the paved road, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in days. I never went back. I never contacted the owner, never asked for a refund. I didn't want to explain what happened, and I didn't want to hear that nothing unusual had ever been reported. All I knew was that someone had been out there, watching, waiting, testing the edges of my fear, night after night. The cabin might still be standing in that clearing, the footprints long since washed away, but I can't forget the sound of those steps on the porch, slow and patient as if the woods themselves were walking closer. And I know, if I had stayed one more night, they would have made it inside. I had been wanting to get away from the noise of the city for a while, so when a friend told me about a small cabin that could be rented cheap for a weekend, I didn't think twice. It was supposed to be simple, quiet, tucked into the woods near a lake with no neighbors close by. That was exactly what I needed. I packed light, mostly just food, water, a sleeping bag, and some basic gear. I figured I wouldn't need much. I wanted to disconnect, to let my head clear. The drive up was longer than I expected. Once I left the highway, the road turned into a cracked two-lane path that twisted through the trees. The woods grew thicker the deeper I went, and the light from the sun seemed weaker as the tall pines pressed in over the road. I kept going, following the directions scribbled on a paper my friend had given me. There was no phone signal anymore. I glanced at my phone a couple of times, but all it showed was no service. That didn't bother me at first. In fact, it was part of the reason I came. After about 40 minutes of winding dirt roads, I finally spotted a narrow trail that looked almost forgotten. The sign at the start was rotting and half fallen, but I could still make out the faded word cabin. I turned down it slowly, careful with the rocks and potholes. The trail went on for maybe half a mile before it opened into a small clearing. That was where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I expected, almost like a large shed. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagging slightly, but it looked stable. The windows were covered in grime, and the front porch leaned to one side. I parked near the edge of the clearing and sat there for a moment, staring at it. Something about it looked wrong. Not broken, not unsafe exactly, just wrong. The air around it was so still. I shut off the car and the silence rushed in. No birds, no rustle of leaves, nothing. Just silence. I forced myself to shake it off and carried my bag up to the porch. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. It was a mixture of damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. I stood in the doorway, breathing shallow, letting my eyes adjust. The inside was one large room. A wood stove sat in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs in another, and against the far wall was a bunk with a thin mattress. The place looked like no one had been there for years, but it was intact. I put my bag down and walked through slowly, testing the floorboards with my weight. Some groaned under me, but they held. There was no electricity, no running water, and no bathroom except for an outhouse behind the cabin. That didn't bother me. I had brought what I needed. After setting up my sleeping bag on the bunk, I unpacked some food and ate quietly. Still, I couldn't shake the strange stillness outside. When the sun began to drop, I went out onto the porch. The clearing was surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The trees seemed closer than before. Their branches tangled together so tightly that the sky was only visible in thin strips. I strained my ears for any sign of life. No birds, no crickets, no frogs by the lake I knew had to be nearby. Nothing. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, made you hyper-aware of every movement you made. That night, I lit a lantern inside and sat by the stove. I didn't build a fire because the air was already warm, but the stove gave me something solid to look at. a corner of the room that felt less empty. I tried reading from a book I brought, but the silence kept pulling my attention back. Every small creak in the cabin felt amplified, like footsteps on old stairs, even though I knew it was just the wood shifting. I finally lay down on the bunk and pulled the sleeping bag over me. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but I was tired from the long drive. I turned the lantern off and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The only light came from the moon slipping through cracks in the window grime. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the unease. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I realized it was because I had heard something, a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it was clear. It sounded like a footstep crunching on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. Another step followed. Slow, careful. I sat up in the dark, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. But the steps were too deliberate, too spaced apart. They circled around the cabin, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never rushed. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be pacing around me, tracing the edge of the clearing. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat frozen on the bunk until the steps finally faded away into the woods. Even then, I stayed awake for hours listening. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, nerves, maybe an animal after all. I forced myself outside, checked the ground around the cabin. I found nothing at first, just scattered pine needles and dirt. Then near the back corner, I spotted it. A footprint, clear in the mud. Human, barefoot. The toes were pressed deep as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I felt my stomach twist. I didn't know what to do. I could pack up and leave, but the trail was rough, and I didn't like the thought of driving it at night if I ended up coming back late. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably old, left by some hiker or maybe even by whoever last used the cabin. I tried to put it out of my mind. The day passed slowly. I tried hiking a bit just to keep busy, but the woods felt too dense. Every path I took seemed to lead me in circles. After an hour, I gave up and returned to the clearing. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading, eating, and walking the perimeter of the cabin like I was on guard duty. I told myself it was just for exercise, but deep down I knew it was because of the footprint. That night I couldn't relax. I kept the lantern burning low and sat awake on the bunk. Around midnight the noises started again. This time there was no mistaking it. The steps were slower, heavier. Whoever it was wasn't pacing. They were closer, circling tighter around the cabin, dragging their feet through the leaves. At one point the sound stopped right outside the wall near where I sat. I could hear breathing, long, steady, patient breaths. I wanted to shout, to make noise, to scare them off, but my throat felt locked. I just sat there, clutching the edge of the bunk, frozen. After what felt like forever, the steps began again, moving away into the woods. I barely slept the rest of the night. When morning came, I checked again outside. More prints this time, circling the cabin, bare feet all around. Whoever it was, they had been walking the clearing for hours. Some prints overlapped each other. Some pressed so deep the toes left sharp ridges. That was when I decided I had to leave. I went inside, started packing my things. But then I stopped. I thought about the trail, how rough it was, how easy it would be for someone to block it or follow me if they knew I was leaving. The prints proved they had been watching the cabin. What if they were waiting? The thought of being trapped out there, my car broken down or stuck, felt worse than staying put. So I decided to wait one more day. One more night. Then I'd leave first thing in the morning. The hours dragged by. I didn't eat much, didn't move much. I just listened. The woods stayed silent, heavier than ever, like even the animals had fled. By the time the sun went down, I had built up a wall of fear inside me so thick I couldn't think straight. That night, I kept the lantern burning bright. I didn't care if it gave me away. I wanted the light. I sat by the stove again, gripping the handle of a knife I had brought for cooking. The steps came earlier this time, before midnight. Slow, steady, circling. At one point I heard the porch creak. Someone was standing right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for the knob to turn. It didn't. Instead, the steps moved again, circling, dragging. Hours passed like that. Just before dawn, the noises stopped. When I finally opened the door, I found fresh footprints on the porch itself. Bare feet. The prints ended right at the door, toes pressed deep into the wood as if the person had stood there for a long time. That was enough. I packed everything in a rush, barely checking if I left anything behind. I loaded the car and started it as fast as I could. The trail out felt longer than before, every bump and rock threatening to trap me there. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me. But I didn't. The road eventually widened, the trees thinned, and finally I reached the highway. Only when I saw other cars did I let myself breathe again. I never told my friend what happened. I never asked about the cabin again. But the memory stayed. The silence. The footprints. The breathing outside the wall. Whoever it was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They knew I was there. They had been waiting, watching, and I will never forget the sound of bare feet circling me in the dark. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. Not the kind of alone where you're still close to a road or where you can see the glow of a town over the trees at night, but the kind of alone where you know you won't hear another human voice for days. I thought of it as escape, a way to quiet my head and breathe away from the rush of everyday life. That was why I said yes when a coworker told me about his family's old hunting cabin. He hadn't been there in years and said it was falling apart, but if I wanted a quiet weekend, I could use it. I didn't even think twice. The place was 4 hours from the city, tucked deep into a stretch of land that pressed against the edge of a state forest. The last 30 minutes of the drive was along a narrow dirt road that twisted through hills and valleys. When I finally saw the cabin, it sat in a hollow, surrounded on all sides by tall pines and tangled brush. It looked lonely, the way buildings sometimes do when they've been left too long without people. The wood was gray with age, the windows cloudy, and the roof sagged in the middle. I parked beside it and sat for a minute with the engine off. The air felt heavy, still, with nothing but the soft ticking of cooling metal from the car. I had expected to hear birds or at least the distant groan of wind in the trees, but the woods were quiet. It was a strange kind of silence, the kind where you feel like something is holding its breath. The first step onto the porch creaked so loud I froze. Listening, nothing moved. I unlocked the door with the key my coworker had given me and stepped inside. The air smelled like damp wood and dust, the kind of smell that clings to old barns. The room was simple. Wooden floor, a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom. A small kitchen sat in one corner, but the counters were bare except for a stack of cracked plates. I walked through the cabin slowly, checking each room. The bedroom had one bed with a sagging mattress, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and nothing else. I opened the drawers but found them empty. The bathroom was little more than a small closet with a sink and toilet that looked like they hadn't been used in years. Everything was quiet still, waiting. After bringing in my bag and setting it on the bed, I went back outside. The sun had dropped lower, painting the tops of the trees orange. I walked around the cabin studying it. The walls were rough, scarred by weather. Some boards looked soft with rot. Behind it, a slope rose steep into thick woods. In front, the land dipped into a narrow valley that ran out of sight. The whole place felt tucked away, almost hidden. I tried to shake the unease that kept creeping up my back. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods alone. It would feel normal after a while. I set up my small supplies, lit a fire in the fireplace, and made a simple dinner from the food I had brought. As darkness filled the valley, I sat in one of the chairs, staring at the fire. The silence pressed in harder. I didn't even hear insects. At one point I stood and opened the door just to listen. The forest was black and empty, no sound of owls, no rustle of leaves. It felt wrong. I shut the door quickly and locked it. The first night was restless. Every creak of the cabin made me jolt awake. I would lie in the bed staring into the dark, listening. I thought I heard faint movement outside, like something stepping slowly in the leaves, but when I strained my ears, it faded. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard a single sharp knock on the far side of the cabin, as if someone tapped the wall with their knuckles. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling until dawn finally came. In the morning, I told myself it must have been an animal. A deer, maybe, brushing against the wall. I forced myself outside into the bright light of day. The valley looked calm, the trees whispering in a light breeze. The cabin didn't seem so threatening now. I walked the area, following the slope down the valley. The ground was soft with pine needles, and after 10 minutes of walking, I found a shallow creek. I followed it upstream for a while until the land grew thicker with brush, then turned back. When I circled behind the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. In the dirt beside the back wall was a mark. At first I thought it was a boot print. It was faint, but the shape looked like the heel and sole of a shoe pressed into the soil. I knelt and touched it. The edges were sharp, not worn by rain. It was fresh. I stood slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, no sound. I tried to tell myself it could have been mine, but I knew I hadn't walked there the day before. That second night I couldn't relax. The silence was heavier, like the woods themselves were listening. I sat by the fire long after midnight, my eyes on the door. At some point I must have dozed in the chair, because I woke to the faintest creak outside the porch. My whole body went cold. I didn't move, barely breathing. Another creak, then silence. I sat frozen for hours until gray light came through the windows. When I finally opened the door, the porch looked normal. But in the dirt at the bottom of the steps, I saw them. Footprints. Clear this time. Boots. They led away into the trees. I felt my stomach twist. Someone had been here in the night. I spent the morning debating what to do. The cabin was deep in the valley with no signal, and the dirt road was miles back. My car was the only way out, but the idea of walking through the trees to reach it made me uneasy. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through, but then, why come so close to the cabin? Why walk onto the porch? By late afternoon, I was jumpy at every sound. I kept looking out the window toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. I set a heavy chair against the door before lying in bed. That night it was worse. Around midnight I heard it, the sound of slow steps circling the cabin. The wood of the porch groaned as weight pressed onto it. My chest tightened as I stared at the ceiling, gripping the blanket. The sound stopped, then a faint scrape against the wall like a hand brushing wood. I stayed frozen until the sound drifted away, but I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found new prints in the dirt. More than one set this time, at least 2 people. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window. I knew I should leave. I stuffed my bag, grabbed my keys, and went to the car. The woods felt suffocating as I drove the narrow dirt road, every shadow between trees looking like movement. But after 20 minutes, the road ended. A tree had been dragged across it. Thick trunk, branches blocking the way. It hadn't fallen naturally. The cut was clean, the work of a saw. I sat in the car, staring, heart hammering. Whoever was out there had blocked the road. They knew I would try to leave. I backed the car into the cabin clearing, shaking, and parked close to the porch. My only thought was to keep the car close if I needed to bolt. The third night was the longest of my life. I sat in the dark with the fire out, afraid the light would give me away. The silence pressed against the cabin walls, thick and suffocating. Sometime after midnight, I heard them again. More than one. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. The crunch of leaves. Then the soft sound of hands testing the windows. The faintest rattle of the doorknob. I gripped a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, sitting rigid in the chair. My breath came shallow and sharp. At one point, I thought I heard whispering outside. Low voices I couldn't make out moving around me. Hours crawled by, then silence again. When dawn came, I checked the yard. More prints. Clearer. They had walked circles around the cabin for hours. At the edge of the valley where the trees thickened, I saw something hanging from a low branch. I walked toward it slowly, heart hammering. It was a strip of cloth tied tight. A piece of shirt maybe, stained dark at one end. It swung lightly in the morning air. I didn't go further. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat shaking. That day I knew I couldn't last another night. I packed everything. When darkness came, I stayed by the door with my bag in my lap, waiting for the first sound. Around midnight, I heard them again. Steps. A low scrape on the porch. The knob rattling. I didn't wait. I ran for the car, threw my bag inside, and started the engine. Headlights cut across the trees, and for 1 second I saw them. Figures at the tree line, 3, maybe 4, standing still, watching. I slammed the car into gear and drove straight into the branches of the fallen tree. The bumper crumpled. Branches screeched against the hood, but the trunk shifted just enough for me to squeeze through. The car jolted, scraping metal, but I didn't stop. I kept driving, tires spitting dirt, until the road opened and the forest thinned. I didn't look back. When I reached the highway hours later, the sun was rising. I pulled into a gas station, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. My car was scarred, the front smashed, branches still caught in the bumper. People stared as I stumbled inside, pale and trembling. I never went back for the rest of my things. I never told my coworker what happened at his family's cabin. I only know that whatever was out there, they weren't lost hunters. They weren't passing strangers. They knew I was there and they wanted me trapped. If I had waited one more night, I don't think I would have left that valley alive. I had been driving for hours before I reached the dirt road. The main highway was empty and wide, but the moment I turned off into the narrow path, it felt like I had stepped out of the world I knew. The trees pressed in on both sides, tall old pines with their branches locked together overhead, letting in only patches of light. My tires cracked over rocks, the sound echoing louder than it should in the silence of the forest. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of light that stretched shadows long across the ground. I rented the cabin weeks before, hoping to spend a few quiet days alone, far from the city. It was supposed to be a way to reset, to put space between myself and the noise of my life. The listing online showed a small wooden place, single-room style with a porch hidden somewhere in the forest. No neighbors nearby, no roads except the one I was on. That was the appeal. When I finally spotted it through the trees, it looked even smaller than the photos. The wood was darker, weathered, and the roof sagged slightly at the edges. A stone chimney rose up on one side, and the front porch leaned forward like it was ready to collapse. I parked in the clearing in front of it, killed the engine, and sat in the silence that followed. No birds, no wind, just stillness pressing against my ears. Inside, it smelled of dust and wood smoke. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked across to set my bag down on the small bed tucked against the wall. There was a single table with 2 chairs, a counter with a sink that I doubted worked, and a fireplace with a blackened grate. In the corner, a small window looked out into the trees. The air inside was cooler than outside, and the quiet was thick. I unpacked slowly, not because I had much, but because there was nothing else to do. A few clothes, some food, a flashlight, a knife I carried when camping. I didn't bring my phone charger on purpose. I wanted the days to feel long, disconnected. I wanted silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the grate, cooked a can of beans, and sat with the sound of the flames filling the space. The cabin groaned occasionally, the wood shifting as the night air cooled, but that seemed normal for something this old. When I lay down on the bed, the mattress was thin, the springs poking into my back, but I was tired enough to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to a faint glow, and the room was dark except for that. The silence was heavy, pressing against me. Then I realized I could hear something outside. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. Leaves shifting, branches snapping under weight. I lay still, listening. It was close, just beyond the cabin walls, moving slowly, stopping, then moving again. I told myself it was a deer, maybe even a bear. The forest was full of animals. That was normal. But the steps sounded careful, like weight being lowered softly instead of crashing through brush. I stared at the ceiling until the sound faded, then forced myself to close my eyes. Sleep took a long time. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and looked around. The clearing was still, nothing seemed disturbed. But when I walked to the edge of the trees, I noticed the ground. The dirt and pine needles were scuffed, like something had been dragged or shifted. I crouched and saw prints. Not paws, boots. Someone had walked along the edge of the clearing, circling close to the cabin. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. My first thought was hunters. Maybe someone was passing through the woods at night, scouting. But the prints were too close. Whoever it was had been no more than 20 feet from the cabin walls. They weren't crossing by. They were stopping, watching. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table. My chest felt tight, my skin prickling as I thought it through. I had wanted isolation, but now the isolation was working against me. No neighbors, no quick road back to town, no phone service. If someone was out there, I was completely alone. The day crawled by. I tried to distract myself, walked a short path into the trees, collected some firewood, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Every time a branch cracked in the distance, I froze. Every time the wind shifted the trees, my chest jumped. By evening, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the prints were old, maybe they weren't as close as I thought. I built a fire outside, cooked some food, and tried to settle into the night. But as soon as darkness fell, the unease came back. I kept the fire burning low in the grate inside, enough to cast faint light. I lay on the bed again, listening to the walls creak, waiting. The silence pressed in harder than the night before. Then I heard it again, a footstep. Not heavy, not rushed. Just one, then another. This time it was right outside the wall by the bed. I held my breath. My skin felt cold, my ears straining for every sound. Whoever it was, they were right there, moving along the cabin wall, slow, steady. They stopped near the window. I stared at the faint outline of it, terrified of seeing a face appear against the glass. The sound stayed there for what felt like forever, then shifted again, circling. By the time it faded, I was gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. Sleep didn't come that night. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The prints were clearer this time, fresh in the dirt, leading right up to the window before circling back into the trees. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I was inside. My first thought was to leave. Pack up, drive back down the dirt road, forget the whole thing. But part of me hesitated. Maybe whoever it was would be gone tonight. Maybe it was a hunter or someone lost. I had paid for 3 nights. I didn't want to feel like I had been chased out by nothing. But as the day dragged on, that confidence faded. The woods felt different now, heavier. I walked the clearing but couldn't shake the thought of eyes hidden in the trees. I stopped going far from the cabin. I kept the knife close. That night was worse. I tried to stay awake, but at some point my eyes closed. A sound pulled me out of it, metal rattling. My stomach dropped. It was the door handle. Someone was testing it, twisting slowly. The lock held, but the sound went on, patient, steady. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, staring at the dark shape of the door. After a long time, it stopped. Then footsteps faded back into the night. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. Whoever it was wasn't just passing by. They were waiting, testing, pushing closer each time. When the first light came, I packed quickly. My hands shook as I shoved things into my bag. I walked outside, ready to throw everything into the car and leave. That's when I saw it. A rope tied around the trunk of a tree at the edge of the clearing. The other end lay coiled in the dirt. Next to it, a shovel leaned against the bark. The prints around it were fresh. I didn't think. I dropped everything, climbed into the car, and started the engine. Gravel spat out from under the tires as I tore back down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides. I didn't look back at the cabin. Didn't stop until the trees thinned and the road opened into the main highway. Only when I was miles away did my hands stop shaking enough to loosen their grip on the wheel. I never found out who it was. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't call the owner of the cabin or report it. Some part of me didn't want answers, because I already knew enough. Someone had been waiting out there in the dark, watching, walking closer each night. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have driven back out of those woods at all. I had been looking for a quiet place to escape for a while. The noise of the city, the constant pressure from work, the endless routine of days blending into nights had left me drained. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only find when you step far away from traffic lights and crowded streets. I found a small cabin listed online, deep in a wooded area that was several hours outside the nearest town. It wasn't expensive, which should have been my first warning sign, but I didn't care. The photo showed a small wooden structure with a porch, a roof that looked like it had been patched more than once, and a single window on the front. It looked old but livable. I booked it without thinking twice. The drive there was long, and the further I went, the more the road narrowed until it was nothing but a cracked strip of asphalt winding through endless trees. The forest looked heavy, as if the branches themselves leaned over the road to watch who dared pass. The late afternoon sun cut through in slanted beams, but most of the forest floor was already drowned in shadow. I had no cell service by the time I got close. The last turn led me down a gravel path that rattled my car so badly I thought my tires would pop. Then I saw it. The cabin standing by itself in a small clearing, as if someone had carved out just enough land for it and nothing else. The place looked even older than the photos had suggested. The wood was darker, probably soaked with years of weather, and the porch sagged a little in the middle. There was no sign of another house, no power lines, no cars, nothing. Just the cabin and the woods pressing in from every side. I killed the engine, stepped out, and the silence hit me hard. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no wind moving through leaves, nothing. I stood there with my bag in my hand, staring at the trees, and I felt uneasy for reasons I couldn't name. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed against the wall. The floor creaked under my weight. There was an old fireplace made of stone, and a stack of wood was piled beside it. The air smelled like dust and something faintly sour like damp wood. The window at the front gave me a view of the porch and the trees beyond, but the glass was streaked and cloudy. There was no bathroom inside, just a bucket tucked in the corner that made me realize I'd be stepping outside for anything else. That didn't bother me at first. I had come here for quiet, and quiet was exactly what I had found. The first couple of hours were almost peaceful. I unpacked a few things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed since the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in years, and started a small fire in the fireplace to fight off the chill. By the time the sun started dipping, the cabin was filled with the warm crackle of burning wood. I sat at the table eating a sandwich I had brought with me, staring out the window as the forest grew darker and darker. The sky turned purple, then black, and that was when I realized how truly alone I was. No faint glow of city lights in the distance, no passing cars, not even a star above since the canopy of trees covered the sky. It was a darkness so complete it pressed against the glass like a weight. I tried to sleep early, but the silence kept me awake. Every small sound in the cabin became loud. The creak of the wood settling, the faint drip of water from somewhere I couldn't place, even my own breathing sounded strange. Too heavy, too slow. I rolled over again and again, staring at the faint outline of the rafters above me, until finally I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, though I couldn't remember what had pulled me from sleep. For a moment I lay there not moving, just listening. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It was the crunch of gravel, the kind of sound you'd hear if someone stepped onto the path. I held my breath, straining my ears. Another crunch, closer this time, followed by the faintest sound of wood groaning, as if the porch had taken some weight. I sat up slowly, the blankets sliding off me. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. I told myself it could have been anything. A branch falling, an animal, even my imagination. But then there was another sound, and it wasn't one I could dismiss. A slow drag, like something rough sliding against the wood of the porch. My skin prickled. The fire had gone out, leaving the cabin in near total darkness except for the thin band of moonlight through the window. I tried to look out, but all I saw was the distorted reflection of the room in the glass. I stayed still for what felt like hours, my muscles aching, until the silence returned. Eventually, I told myself I was being stupid, that I had just been half dreaming. I lay back down, though it took me forever to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The porch had a thin layer of dirt and leaves across it, and at first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But then I noticed the marks. They weren't footprints exactly, but places where the dirt had been disturbed, dragged. Long, uneven streaks leading from the steps toward the edge of the trees. I crouched down, staring at them, trying to make sense of the pattern. It wasn't an animal. Animals left prints, paws, hooves. These looked like something heavy had been pulled or someone had shuffled in a strange way. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. I stood up quickly, went back inside, and locked the door. All day I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood, cleaning the cabin a little, walking the edge of the clearing, but my eyes kept drifting to the tree line. The woods were dense, almost too dense, with the trunks pressed close together and shadows filling every gap. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness, though I never saw anything move. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go further than a few steps into the trees. The air felt heavier there, like something pressed down on me the moment I crossed the edge. That night I tried to sleep again, but sleep didn't come easy. The forest outside remained deathly silent, and that silence became unbearable. I found myself wishing for even the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, anything. Instead, I lay in the dark, wide awake, every nerve in my body waiting for a sound. When it finally came, I nearly jumped out of my skin. A soft scrape against the wall of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like fingers dragging across the wood. I froze, staring at the black window. Then another scrape, this time on the other side. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving around me. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of a kitchen knife I had taken from the counter. By morning I was exhausted, my eyes burning. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the first thing I saw were fresh marks in the dirt near the wall. Long streaks, shallow but clear. Something or someone had circled the cabin. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Work had been dragging me down. City noise never let me rest, and I felt like I hadn't breathed fresh air in years. So when I got the chance to borrow an old cabin tucked away in the woods far from any towns or highways, I grabbed it without thinking twice. I didn't care that it was isolated. I didn't care that it was falling apart. I just wanted silence. The drive up there had been long, the road narrowing the deeper I went into the trees. Eventually, I found myself crawling along a dirt track that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Branches scraped my car, rocks crunched under the tires, and every mile further I went, the more cut off I felt from the rest of the world. By the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin stood, it was already late afternoon. The cabin looked exactly like I expected. Weathered wood, sagging porch, windows dark and dusty. It was small, maybe 2 rooms with a stone chimney leaning slightly to one side. The forest surrounded it on all sides, tall pines pressing in close, their tops swaying against the pale sky. There wasn't another house for miles. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Inside it smelled like old wood and damp. Dust clung to every surface. There was a bed frame in the back room with a thin mattress, a table with 1 chair, and a rusty old stove. I set my bag down, swept the place out with the broom I found by the door, and started unpacking. I'd brought food, a lantern, a hunting knife, and a few other supplies. I knew I wouldn't have cell service here, so I had told myself I was ready to be completely cut off. That first night was uneventful. I cooked on a small camp stove I'd brought, sat out on the porch as the sun went down, and listened to the forest. The stillness was strange at first, but then I began to enjoy it. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. When darkness fell, it fell completely. No streetlights, no passing cars, just blackness so thick it pressed up against the cabin windows. I crawled into bed, pulled the blanket around me, and fell asleep to the creaking of the wood and the sigh of the wind in the trees. The second day I explored a little. There was a stream about half a mile down the slope, and I filled some bottles with cold water. I noticed signs of animals, deer tracks, scat, and even claw marks on a tree trunk. Nothing unusual, just reminders that this was real wilderness. I tried to fish but caught nothing. I wandered deeper, but always kept track of my path so I wouldn't get lost. By the time the sun started sinking, I was back at the cabin, sore but content. That night, though, things began to feel different. I had just settled into bed when I heard it. Something moving outside. At first I thought it was just a deer or raccoon, but the sound was heavier, more deliberate. Leaves crunching, sticks snapping. It circled the cabin once, then stopped. I lay frozen, holding my breath. After a long silence, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. In the damp earth near the porch, I found footprints. Human footprints, bare feet wide long pressed deep into the mud. My stomach knotted when I saw them. They weren't mine. They circled the cabin, leading off into the woods. I stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was probably some drifter, someone passing through. Maybe a hunter who'd lost his boots. I tried not to overthink it. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside my cabin in the dark, watching. The day passed slowly. I chopped some firewood, cleaned up the inside of the cabin, and tried to distract myself. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching from between the trunks. But the woods stayed still, the same endless wall of green. That night, I couldn't relax. I lit the lantern and sat at the table, knife close by, listening for any sound. Hours passed. Then sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The soft crunch of footsteps outside. This time I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The footsteps came right up to the wall of the cabin, stopped, then slowly circled. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shake the table. At one point, the footsteps paused by the window. I didn't dare look. I could almost feel eyes staring in at me through the glass. After what felt like forever, the sound faded back into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to close my eyes. When the gray light finally came, I stumbled outside. More footprints. Clearer this time. Whoever it was had walked barefoot, circling me all night. My throat felt dry. I thought about leaving that morning, packing up and driving back to the city. But a stubborn part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some local messing around. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself I could last a few more days. That day I didn't wander far. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering more wood, double-checking the door and windows. The woods felt different now, heavier, as if something unseen was hiding in them. Birds called less often, and every little rustle set me on edge. By evening, I had made up my mind I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to spend another night here. I cooked a small meal, forced myself to eat, and tried to calm down. But that night was worse than before. It started with scratching on the wall. Slow dragging scratches like fingernails running down the wood. Then the footsteps. This time they didn't just circle. They stopped at the door. I sat frozen on the bed, knife in hand, heart hammering. The doorknob rattled softly at first, then harder. Someone was trying to get in. I had wedged a chair under the knob earlier and it held. After a long while, the rattling stopped. Silence. Then I heard the slow crunch of footsteps moving around to the back window. A tap on the glass. Light, almost playful. My skin crawled. Hours passed like that. Sounds moving around the cabin, stopping, starting again. I never saw a face, but I knew whoever it was wanted me to know they were out there. When dawn finally came, I was already packed. I didn't even bother eating. I threw my bag into the car, started the engine, and sped down the dirt track. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't look back until I hit the main road. Only then did I breathe. Relief washed over me. I told myself it was over, that I'd been smart to leave. But when I stopped at a gas station miles away, I opened the trunk to grab a drink. Inside, nestled between my bags, was a single muddy footprint. Bare, wide, pressed into the fabric. I stood there staring, the noise of the gas station fading around me, realizing with cold certainty that whoever had circled my cabin hadn't stayed behind. They had come with me. I had been wanting some quiet for a while. Life in the city had worn me down. Constant traffic, noise, people pressing against me in crowded streets. The endless rush that never stopped. A friend had once told me about a small cabin near a place called Random Lake, far north in the woods, where there was no reception, no neighbors, and no paved roads for miles. I remembered the way he said it. You'll either love it or hate it, nothing in between. That stuck with me. When I finally had a week free, I decided to try it out. I loaded up my old SUV with supplies, cans of food, bottled water, a hatchet, a heavy flashlight, Extra batteries, a small camping stove, some blankets, and a couple of paperbacks I had never found the time to read. The cabin was supposed to be fully stocked with wood and had a working fireplace, but I brought more than I thought I'd need. I didn't like being caught unprepared. I left before dawn, hoping to make the drive in one stretch, the GPS taking me north along winding highways until the signs thinned out and the trees closed in. By mid-afternoon I had reached the last stretch, a dirt road that looked more like an old logging trail than anything meant for vehicles. The trees leaned close, tall pines that blocked out much of the sunlight, and my tires crunched over rocks and roots. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid wrecking the undercarriage. The air felt different the deeper I went. Heavier, quieter, the kind of silence where even birds seemed to think twice before making noise. When the road finally opened, I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I imagined, sitting in a clearing with Random Lake visible just beyond it, dark and still, with reeds at its edges and black pines surrounding it like a wall. The cabin was made of rough logs, weathered gray, with a pitched roof of rusted metal. The windows had shutters closed tight, and the porch sagged slightly with age. There was no other structure in sight, no dock on the lake, not even a trail heading further. It looked cut off from everything. I killed the engine and the silence slammed down on me. For a moment I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the faint slap of water against the lake's shore. No hum of traffic, no faint airplane overhead, nothing. Just stillness. I unloaded my gear, the crunch of my boots on the gravel sounding too loud, and carried everything up to the porch. The door was stiff, swollen from years of damp, but it opened with a hard shove. The smell hit me first. Musty wood, old smoke, and the faint tang of mildew. Inside, it was one room, simple. A stone fireplace against the far wall, a bed frame with a thin mattress, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with dusty jars and cans. A single window looked out toward the lake, its glass cloudy. The air inside was cold and stale. I opened the shutters and cracked the window, letting in the smell of pine and damp earth. The quiet was so complete it was like I had stepped into a vacuum. Even my own breathing sounded too sharp. I set up my things, lit a fire in the fireplace with some of the wood stacked inside, and boiled water for coffee on the camping stove. The firelight filled the cabin with warmth, pushing the shadows back, and for a while I felt at ease. The lake was still visible through the window, flat as a mirror, not a ripple across its surface. By nightfall, the woods had turned black. I stepped outside once to take a leak and felt the weight of the dark pressing on me. The trees were solid walls of shadow, the lake nothing but an empty hole of blackness. I went back inside quickly, bolted the door, and sat by the fire. I told myself it was nothing unusual, just wilderness, just me unused to it. But there was something about that silence that made me uneasy. I slept poorly. Every creak of the old logs, every groan of the wind outside snapped me awake. At one point I thought I heard something moving around the porch, a faint scrape of wood like weight shifting. But when I held my breath and listened hard, there was nothing. I finally drifted into uneasy sleep sometime after 3. In the morning, the lake was covered in mist. I made breakfast from a can, stepped outside with a mug of instant coffee, and walked down toward the water. The ground was soft and muddy, reeds brushing against my legs, the smell of wet earth rising strong. The mist was thick, curling off the water, so I couldn't see far across it. The woods behind me were still. I didn't hear a single bird. That bothered me more than it should have. I explored around the cabin for a while, finding only thick woods, no trails, no paths. The trees closed in so tightly it was easy to lose sight of the cabin after a few minutes. I forced myself to turn back before wandering too far. I didn't like the idea of getting lost in woods like that. By the second night, I started noticing things. The first was the sound. Just after dark, when the fire had burned down and I was sitting in bed with a flashlight, I heard it. Soft, steady steps outside on the porch. Not animal sounds, not the scurry of paws or claws. These were slow, measured like weight shifting on the wood, one after another. I froze, light off, heart thudding. The steps moved across the porch, paused by the door, then creaked away again. I waited for hours, too afraid to look out the window. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing unusual. No footprints, no marks. Just the same old warped wood. I told myself maybe the logs creaked with the night air cooling. Maybe animals moved around and my brain turned it into footsteps. I tried to convince myself of that, but I didn't really believe it. That day I found something stranger. Down near the edge of the lake, half sunk into the mud, was a boot. An old leather work boot, waterlogged, the laces frayed, the leather cracked. It looked like it had been there for years. I nudged it with a stick and the mud sucked at it. I felt an odd chill looking at it, like I had found something I wasn't meant to. I left it there, not wanting to touch it with my hands. The third night was worse. I was dozing by the fire when I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch, slow and steady. This time I held my breath and waited. The steps came right to the door. The boards groaned under the weight.
And then, a faint sound of pressure against the wood, like something pressing lightly on the door, testing it.
My heart hammered. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought and sat frozen, staring at the door. After what felt like forever, the weight shifted away. The steps moved back across the porch and silence fell again. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day I decided to check the woods more carefully. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, scanning the ground. About 50 yards back, between two pines, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A fire pit. Old, filled with blackened stones and ash, and around it broken beer bottles, a rusted cooking pot, and scraps of torn fabric half buried in the dirt. Not fresh, but not decades old either. Maybe a year, maybe less. Whoever had used it hadn't bothered to clean up. I stood there a long time, staring at it, the woods pressing in close. It felt wrong, like someone had been here recently, watching the same cabin I was now inside. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, the silence swallowing me whole. That night I barely kept the fire going. I sat with the hatchet across my lap, every muscle tense. Around midnight the footsteps came again. This time I didn't just hear them on the porch. I heard them moving around the cabin, slow, circling, stopping under the window, then moving on. The boards of the porch groaned. The window glass rattled faintly, like something brushed against it. My throat was dry, every nerve screaming to do something, but I didn't move. When dawn came, I stumbled outside, bleary-eyed, and searched for tracks. The ground was soft, damp from dew. I found them, clear prints in the mud near the window, boots human, not mine. They circled the cabin, pressed deep into the dirt, leading back into the woods. I followed them a short way, heart hammering, until the trees swallowed them, and the ground turned too hard to show signs. Whoever had been there had been close. Too close. The fourth night was the breaking point. I didn't light a fire, hoping the dark would hide me. I sat in silence, flashlight off, back against the wall, staring at the door. Hours passed in quiet, my breathing shallow. Then faint at first, the steps came again. Not just one set this time, two, maybe three. Moving slowly around the cabin, boards groaning under their weight. They stopped at the door. I heard the faint sound of metal against metal, the knob rattling. My stomach turned to ice. The knob twisted, slow, testing. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hands ached. The door held. The knob rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. The footsteps lingered. I thought I heard faint breathing on the other side of the wood. Minutes stretched like hours. Then slowly the steps retreated, fading into the woods. I sat there until the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky. I didn't move, didn't breathe properly until the woods brightened. When I finally stepped outside, my hands were shaking. The prints in the dirt were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading down toward the lake, back into the trees. More than one person. Watching, waiting, that was enough. I packed my gear fast, shoving everything into the SUV, not caring how neatly. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared loud and jarring in the silence. I reversed. I had been planning a short break from work for months. My head was drowning in endless files and deadlines, and I wanted a place far away from the city noise. A friend told me about a small cabin he once rented deep in the woods. It was cheap, old, but hidden in silence. The kind of place where you could hear your own thoughts again. That was all I needed. I booked it for 4 nights. The drive itself took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were nothing but winding dirt roads through thick forest. The deeper I went, the more I felt cut off from the rest of the world. My phone signal dropped to nothing halfway in, and the silence around me felt heavier the further I drove. When I finally reached the cabin, it stood at the end of a narrow trail, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked most of the sky. The place was exactly what I expected. Weathered wood, a small porch, a tin roof patched with rust, and a single chimney that leaned slightly to one side. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and damp earth. There was one main room with a bed against the wall, a small table and a wood stove. A separate corner led to a cramped bathroom with no running hot water, just a pump that creaked when I tested it. The silence in that cabin pressed against my ears, as if it swallowed all sound the moment I closed the door. At first, I liked it. I lit a fire in the stove, unpacked a small cooler of food, and walked around the clearing before dusk. The woods were so thick it was like looking into a wall of shadows. Every snap of a twig carried further than it should. I forced myself to enjoy it, to breathe in the stillness. By nightfall, the forest turned black. Not dark like the city, but pitch black with no glow from streetlights or passing cars. Only the cabin's single lamp kept the night from flooding in. That first night was quiet except for the creaks of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. I told myself the noises were normal, but lying there in the bed, I kept staring at the thin curtains over the window. My mind played tricks, thinking I saw shapes in the dark outside, but I reminded myself it was just shadows from the fire. Eventually, I drifted to sleep. The next day, I hiked a short way into the forest with a small backpack. I followed a deer trail until I reached a creek where the water ran cold and clear. It was beautiful, but unnerving too. No sounds of people, just the constant rush of water and an occasional bird call. After a few hours, I headed back. When I returned to the cabin, something about the porch bothered me. I had left my boots on the side before going out, but they were shifted closer to the door. I told myself I must have forgotten where I put them, but the thought gnawed at me. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the cabin door even though the lock looked like it hadn't been used in years. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard faint crunching sounds outside, like footsteps on the dead leaves. I held my breath, listening. But when I looked through the curtain, the forest was only a solid wall of black. Sleep came in short bursts. On the third morning, I noticed something worse. In the dirt near the porch, clear footprints led from the woods up to the steps. They weren't mine, I hadn't walked that way. The prints were large, wider than mine, made by boots with heavy treads. They stopped at the porch, then turned back into the trees. My chest tightened as I stared at them. Someone had been there in the night. I walked the edge of the clearing, scanning the woods. The trees seemed closer than before, like they leaned in to hide whoever might be inside them. My mind raced. Was it hunters? A drifter? Someone else hiding in the forest? I thought about packing up and leaving, but the long dirt road made me hesitate. If someone was out there, maybe they were watching, waiting. Driving off alone down miles of empty road didn't feel safe either. I stayed. I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just passed through. Still, I kept checking the windows all afternoon. Every sound of wind in the branches made me jump. By evening, I dragged the table and a chair against the door. I left the lamp on all night, the shadows stretching long across the wooden walls. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, then a pause. My heart pounded. I listened, frozen, barely breathing. The sound came again, like someone's hand sliding along the wood, moving around the outside. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, then at the windows. The sound circled, first near the back wall, then near the porch, then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the small hatchet I'd found near the woodpile. When the light finally seeped through the trees, I stepped outside. More prints were in the dirt, circling the cabin, stopping and starting as if whoever made them had stood watching for long stretches of time. My food was still inside, untouched, but I felt watched. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no insects, only the sound of my own breathing. I walked a few feet into the trees, scanning every direction, but there was nothing. Just endless trunks fading into shadow. The fourth night was the worst. I decided not to sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the hatchet in my lap, staring at the door. Hours crawled by. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the porch creak. Someone was standing on it. The doorknob rattled softly, testing the lock. My throat went dry. I gripped the hatchet tighter, every muscle locked in place. The rattling stopped. Then came the sound of slow, heavy breathing right outside the door. Whoever it was stood there for minutes, maybe longer, just breathing. My legs shook. I wanted to shout to scare them off, but fear held my mouth shut. Finally, the steps moved off the porch. I heard them crunch through the leaves, fading into the trees. At dawn, I didn't wait. I packed my bag in minutes, threw everything into the car, and sped down the dirt road without even checking the mirrors. My chest didn't unclench until miles later, when the forest finally opened and cell signal returned. When I stopped at a gas station near the highway, I checked the car. On the back window, smeared in what looked like dirt from a hand, was a single streak, as if someone had dragged their fingers across the glass. I hadn't noticed it before. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been close enough to touch the car. Maybe during the night when I sat awake inside the cabin. I drove straight home and never went back. I didn't tell anyone the full story, only that I cut the trip short. But the image of those prints circling the cabin, the sound of breathing on the other side of the door, and that streak on my car window still follow me. I had gone there to find silence, but what I found was the kind of silence that hides someone else's presence. The kind that waits, watches, and doesn't need to speak to tell you that you were never alone out there. I had been looking forward to getting away for weeks. Life in the city had been choking me. The endless traffic, the constant sound of horns, and the stale air that never seemed fresh no matter how much I opened my windows. I rented a small cabin up north, far away from the noise and people. It was supposed to be peaceful, a quiet retreat where I could breathe without feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The drive took most of the day. The last stretch was a narrow road winding through thick trees. I didn't see another car for almost an hour. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low. It sat alone on a small clearing, surrounded by dark woods that seemed to press in from every side. The structure looked old but solid, built from heavy logs. The roof sagged a little at the edges, but it looked like it had been standing there for decades and would probably last decades more. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single main room with a small kitchen tucked to one side, a fireplace on the other, and a short hallway that led to a bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was worn but clean. A faded couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in a long time. The first evening was quiet. I unpacked, set up some food I had brought in a cooler, and stretched out on the couch. Outside the windows, the woods grew darker until they were just a wall of blackness. I could hear insects buzzing, the occasional bird calling out, and then nothing but silence. It was the kind of silence you never get in the city. For a while, it felt comforting. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight came through the thin curtains in the bedroom, and the woods outside were alive with the sound of birds. I made coffee on the small gas stove and stepped outside to breathe the cool air. The clearing was quiet except for the chirps and rustles from the trees. The grass around the cabin was knee-high in places, and the path that led to the main road was already half hidden by weeds. I decided to explore. Behind the cabin, the woods were thick. The trees were tall and close together, their branches knitting into a roof that kept the ground dim. I followed what looked like a faint trail, though it was hard to tell if it was man-made or just the natural space where animals passed. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. Every now and then I would hear something moving through the brush, probably deer or squirrels, though I never saw them. After an hour of walking, I felt uneasy. The woods were disorienting. No matter which way I turned, everything looked the same. The trees were endless, and the faint trail I had been following faded away until I wasn't sure if I was still on it. I turned back, but for a few minutes I wasn't sure if I was even going in the right direction. My heart started to race until I finally recognized the outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me, but the unease stuck with me. The rest of the day I stayed close to the cabin. I read a little, dozed on the couch, and cooked a simple meal. As night fell, I sat by the fireplace with a small fire burning, just enough to keep the shadows from swallowing the room. The silence outside was heavier that night. It pressed against the windows as if the woods themselves were leaning closer. That was when I first noticed the sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. A faint rustling, like something brushing against the cabin walls. But the trees outside weren't swaying. The air was completely still. The noise came again, a faint crunch like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze on the couch, listening. The sound didn't come again for a long time, and eventually I convinced myself it was just an animal passing through. The woods were full of them. It wasn't anything unusual, but later that night as I was lying in bed I heard it again. Slow, deliberate crunching outside the bedroom wall, not the light scurry of a raccoon or the quick movements of a deer. It sounded heavier, more controlled, the kind of step that belonged to someone trying not to be heard. I lay completely still, every muscle tense, ears straining. The sound moved past the window, then faded into silence. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to return. When morning came, I tried to tell myself it had been a dream. Maybe I had half woken during the night and imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach sink. The grass around the cabin was pressed down in a line, as though someone had walked slowly along the wall. The prints weren't clear, just flattened patches of grass, but they circled the cabin once before vanishing into the woods. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a deer had wandered close in the night. Maybe I was making more of it than I should, but the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The third night, I made sure to bolt the door and check the windows before bed. I even pushed one of the chairs under the handle of the front door, like that would stop anything. The fire had burned low in the fireplace, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move when I looked at them too long. Around midnight, the sound came again. This time it was clearer, closer, definite footsteps circling slowly outside. Crunch, pause, crunch. Whoever it was, they were moving with care, but not enough to hide it completely. My mouth went dry. My hands gripped the blanket tight. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. I pictured someone standing just beyond the door, listening. Then the sound of something faint scraping against wood. Not loud, just the light scratch of something running along the wall. My skin crawled. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I checked outside again. On the front door frame near the handle there were faint marks. Thin scratches, fresh ones carved shallow into the wood. They hadn't been there before. I felt something shift inside me then. The quiet peace I had come here for was gone. I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, someone who knew I was here, and who was coming back at night to circle the cabin, to scrape at the walls. For the rest of the day I tried to distract myself. I read, I wrote in a notebook. I walked a little around the clearing. But no matter what I did, I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. That night I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. Hours dragged by. The woods outside were silent again. Then close to 2 in the morning I heard the steps. They came slower this time. Crunch, long pause. Crunch. The sound of breathing, faint but unmistakable, just outside the window. I held my breath, my hand slick with sweat around the knife handle. The sound moved to the back of the cabin, then stopped. The silence stretched so long I almost convinced myself they had gone. Then came a new sound, the back door rattling, soft but steady, like someone testing it. The metal handle clicked faintly. The door held, but the sound went on for minutes. Then finally silence again. When morning came, I checked the back door. The handle was scratched and the wood around it looked fresh, chipped in places like something had been digging into it. I knew then this wasn't random. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't someone lost in the woods. Whoever it was, they wanted in, and they were testing night after night, learning the cabin, waiting for the right chance. I thought about leaving that day. I thought about throwing everything in the car and driving back down that long road until I saw another town. But something held me back. Part of it was stubbornness, part of it was fear that leaving in a rush would mean whoever was out there might catch me on the road. The cabin at least had walls, a door, some kind of barrier. Out there I'd be exposed. The fourth night was worse. I sat awake again, my body aching with exhaustion, my eyes burning. The sounds came earlier this time. More footsteps, closer, heavier, scraping along the windows, faint taps like fingers brushing the glass. My pulse hammered so hard I thought I might pass out. The fire had died. The room was dark except for the weak beam of my flashlight. At one point I thought I saw the shadow of a head pass across the window. I couldn't be sure. When the sounds finally stopped, I sat shaking until morning. That day I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, stuffing clothes back into my bag, throwing food into the cooler. Every sound outside made me jump. I felt eyes on me from the trees. When I finally stepped outside with my bags, the clearing was silent. The woods stood dark and still. My car sat where I had left it. As I walked toward it, I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. I turned once toward the trees. For just a second, I thought I saw something pale between the trunks. A face maybe watching. Then it was gone. I didn't wait to look again. I shoved everything into the car and started it. The engine roared too loud in the silence. As I pulled away down the overgrown path, I looked back once at the cabin. It stood there in the clearing, quiet and harmless, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Someone had been out there every night, circling, scratching, testing. Someone who knew the cabin was isolated, who knew I was alone, who had been waiting for the right moment to come inside. I never went back. I never will. But even now, when I lie awake at night, I sometimes hear the faint sound of slow. I drove into the hills on a Friday afternoon, the old dirt road stretching in front of me like it hadn't been driven on in weeks. Dust clung to the windshield and rolled off the hood in thick clouds whenever I hit a dip. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of heavy smell that only comes after rain has soaked into the ground for days. I had rented a cabin online, a small wooden place that was supposed to be hidden deep in the woods. I told myself I wanted peace and quiet, a break from everything, but part of me knew I was just running away from noise and people. The deeper I went, the rougher the road got. Potholes jerked the car, tree branches scraped the sides, and the tires cracked twigs that had fallen across the track. For a long while, there were no signs of houses, no mailboxes, nothing but trees pressing in close, their tops swaying in the wind. It felt like I was leaving behind the world and driving into a place that didn't want to be reached. By the time I finally saw the small clearing with the cabin sitting in the center, I felt both relieved and uneasy. The cabin looked older than the pictures online. The wood was darker, weather-stained, and the roof sagged a little on one side. The steps up to the porch had cracks running through them, and one of the railings leaned at a crooked angle. But the windows were intact and the lock on the front door worked, so I told myself it was fine. The silence around the place was heavy. No sound of cars, no voices, not even the faint hum of planes in the distance. Just wind moving through the branches and the occasional creak of the cabin itself. Inside, the air was stale, smelling faintly of dust and damp wood. The floor creaked with every step I took, and the rooms felt cramped. A single bedroom, a small living area with a wood stove, and a kitchen with old appliances that hummed when I plugged them in. The bathroom was barely bigger than a closet. There was no TV, no internet, and only one bar of cell service if I stood in a certain corner of the porch. I had brought food, water, and a flashlight, telling myself I wanted to live simple for the weekend. That first evening, I cooked something small on the stove and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned orange and purple behind the tree line, then slowly bled into darkness. As the light faded, the woods came alive with different sounds. Twigs snapping, insects buzzing, leaves rustling like something was moving just beyond sight. I kept telling myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. But the sounds didn't fade the way I expected. They shifted, circled, then went quiet, only to start again in another direction. I told myself not to overthink. When night fully came, the darkness was absolute. Without streetlights or neighboring houses, the cabin sat swallowed in black. I turned on the small lantern I'd brought, its glow weak against the heavy shadows. The windows reflected my movements back at me, and every creak of the wood sounded louder. I locked the front door, checked the back window latch twice, and finally forced myself into bed. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in the dark, hearing small noises outside. A crunch of leaves, a faint thud, then silence. My mind kept imagining shapes standing just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was just wildlife, that cabins in the woods always sounded like this. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, light poured in through the thin curtains, and the world seemed normal again. The woods looked calm, the air was cool, and the unease of the night before felt distant, almost foolish. I made coffee, ate some breakfast, and decided to hike a little. I found a narrow trail behind the cabin, half overgrown with weeds but still clear enough to follow. The forest closed around me, thick with moss and the smell of pine. I walked for nearly an hour, hearing only my own footsteps and the faint drip of water from leaves. When I finally turned back, I noticed something strange near the cabin. In the soft dirt just a few yards from the porch, there were footprints. Not boots like mine, but shoes, thin soles, smaller prints. They led from the trees toward the cabin, then circled around the side, then disappeared back into the woods. I froze, staring at them. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil, not more than a few hours old. My chest tightened as I looked toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods were still. No movement, no sound. I told myself maybe a hiker had passed through, maybe someone hunting mushrooms or just wandering. But the prints had stopped at the cabin, circled, lingered. They weren't moving past, they were looking. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every sound from the woods made me turn my head. Every creak of the cabin floor made me check the windows. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably nothing. By late afternoon, I forced myself to relax with a book on the porch. The sun was warm, and for a little while I convinced myself I was safe. That night, though, the noises started again. Louder this time. Something moving slowly through the brush, closer than before. My heart pounded as I sat in the dark, the lantern off, listening. Leaves crunched. A twig snapped. Then silence, heavy and deliberate, as if whatever was out there had stopped to listen too. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. Hours seemed to pass like that, the night dragging on endlessly. When dawn finally came, I opened the door to look outside. The ground was marked again, new prints, circling the cabin in tighter loops. And this time, near the back window, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A smudge on the glass, like the oily mark of a hand pressed against it. I locked every door and window, packed my bag, and told myself I was leaving. But when I reached the car, my heart sank. The tires were slashed. All four of them, cut deep, rubber hanging loose. My keys shook in my hand as I tried to start the engine anyway. But of course it was useless. I was trapped. I spent the day barricading. I moved a chair under the front door handle, stacked furniture against the back door, nailed shut the side window with loose boards I found in the shed. Every sound from the woods kept me jumpy. The flap of a bird's wings, the crack of a branch. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them, watching, waiting. That night was the longest of my life. The noises came again, circling, stopping, starting. At one point, the doorknob rattled, slow and testing. Then silence. Hours later, a scraping sound moved along the side of the cabin like something metal dragging against wood. I gripped the flashlight in my hand until my knuckles hurt, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. It never came. When morning light finally seeped through, I forced myself outside. The ground was a mess of footprints now, circling the cabin over and over. I followed them into the trees, but they scattered, fading in all directions like whoever made them didn't want to be tracked. I thought about walking out, following the road back down, but it stretched for miles through empty woods. If someone had done this, they could follow me easily. Out there, I would be exposed. By the third night, exhaustion made me careless. I must have dozed off in the chair by the window, lantern still lit. I woke to the faint sound of breathing. Not my own, close. My eyes darted to the window, and in the dim light I saw it. The faint outline of a face on the glass, just beyond the reflection. Pale skin, dark eyes watching. I froze, too afraid to move. The face stayed for what felt like forever, then slowly disappeared into the dark. I sat shaking, gripping the lantern, my throat dry. My body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. By morning, I made my choice. I packed what I could carry, grabbed the small hatchet from the shed, and set out down the dirt road. The woods were silent, too silent as I walked. Every few minutes, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. I kept walking, my legs burning, sweat running down my back. Hours later, the road finally widened, and I saw the first sign of another car parked on the shoulder. Relief surged through me so strong I almost collapsed. But when I got closer, I stopped cold. The car was abandoned, its windows broken, weeds growing up around the tires. On the hood, faint but clear, were the same oily handprints I had seen on my cabin window. My stomach dropped. I realized then that whoever had been circling the cabin wasn't just passing through. They had been here long before me, watching, waiting, living in these woods unseen. And now I was out in the open with miles still to go and nowhere to hide. I kept walking, forcing one step after another, but the trees on either side felt tighter, the shadows deeper. Every sound made me flinch. Somewhere behind me, faint and steady, I thought I heard footsteps. Slow, careful, matching mine. I didn't stop to check. I just kept moving, knowing that leaving the cabin hadn't saved me. It had only put me where they wanted me, out in the open on the road, far from help. I'd been looking forward to a quiet week in the woods, away from work, noise, and people. A coworker had told me about an old rental cabin far off a mountain road, hidden deep between tall pines and oaks. It was cheap, and I wanted space where I could breathe without traffic and city voices. I booked it, packed enough food for the week, brought a cooler, camping gear in case anything went wrong, and drove out there on a late September morning. The first thing I noticed when I turned off the main road was how empty the place felt. The gravel path leading to the cabin stretched for miles, weaving through thick forest. Branches reached over the road like they were trying to close it in. My phone had already lost its signal about 10 minutes earlier, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. No cars, no houses, no signs of other people. Just me and the crunch of gravel under my tires. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked smaller than I had expected. The wood was dark, weathered, almost gray. The roof sagged in places, and the porch leaned slightly to one side. A narrow chimney stuck out from the top, and the windows were small, their glass a little foggy like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The forest pressed close around it, the trees so near that only a strip of light made it through the branches. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment listening. There was nothing. No hum of insects, no birds, no distant rustle of animals. Just silence that felt too heavy for the middle of the woods. It made me hesitate before stepping out. Inside, the cabin was even rougher. One main room held a small kitchen area, a table, 2 wooden chairs, and a couch with old fabric that smelled faintly of mildew. There was one small bedroom with a narrow bed, a creaky frame, and a closet door that didn't quite shut. The bathroom was cramped, its sink rust-stained, and the shower looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, it was functional, and I told myself I hadn't come for comfort. I had come for quiet. The first day went as planned. I unpacked, set food in the cooler, stacked firewood I found already chopped out back, and spent the afternoon walking near the cabin, mapping the area in my head so I wouldn't get lost. The air was cool, the leaves beginning to turn, and for a while I thought maybe this was exactly what I needed. But even that first night, something felt wrong. The forest was too still. When the sun dropped and the light faded from the windows, the silence thickened. No crickets, no owls, nothing. I lit a fire in the wood stove and tried to read by lantern light, but I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something out there. When I finally went to bed, I locked the door, even though I knew no one else was supposed to be anywhere near this place. That night I woke suddenly, hours before dawn, with the heavy sense that something had moved outside. The cabin was so dark it was hard to tell if my eyes were open. I held still and listened. At first there was nothing, but then I heard it. Faint, deliberate steps on dry leaves. Slow, uneven, almost dragging. They circled, stopping near the porch, then moved toward the back. I didn't breathe until the sound faded into the woods. In the morning, I told myself it had just been an animal. A deer maybe, or something larger moving through, but when I went out and checked the ground around the porch, I didn't see tracks. Just scattered leaves, undisturbed. I shook it off and tried to go about the day. I hiked deeper into the woods, carrying a small pack with water and a snack. I thought if I walked far enough, I'd hear birds again or find signs of animals. But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. The forest floor looked untouched. No fallen branches broken, no paw prints in the soft ground near a stream I crossed. Even the water ran quiet, like it didn't want to make sound. By the time I turned back, the stillness was crawling under my skin. That night, I sat with the lantern low, listening hard. I told myself I wouldn't let fear make me imagine things. Still, when I heard the same steps again, slow, circling the cabin, I felt my chest tighten. They came closer this time, brushing against the side wall. The wood creaked as if weight had pressed against it. I didn't move from the bed. I just lay there, heart hammering until it stopped. By the third day, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot, my head heavy from lack of sleep. I thought about leaving, but the cabin had no cell signal, and the nearest town was at least an hour down the gravel road. I told myself maybe I was just not used to true silence, that my mind was filling in gaps. But that afternoon, I noticed something I couldn't explain. Near the edge of the trees, maybe 30 yards from the cabin, there was a stump I hadn't seen before. A wide, flat piece of wood, gray and splintered. On top of it, something small and white. I walked over, curious. It was a bone, clean, pale, with sharp ends. Too small for a deer, too smooth for wood. I didn't want to guess what it belonged to. When I went back inside, I shoved a chair under the door handle, though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to come in. That night, I didn't just hear the steps. I heard the porch boards groan. Slow weight shifted on them, pressing them down, then the faint scrape against the door. Not scratching, but a drag, like fingertips or nails tracing across the wood. I held my breath so long my chest ached. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me under, because I woke up hours later to gray light seeping into the cabin. The door was still locked, the chair still in place. I wanted to leave that morning, but something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe just the thought of admitting I was scared of shadows and silence. I decided to last at least one more night. I spent the day chopping some of the wood to keep busy, even though I already had enough. The steady rhythm of the axe kept me from thinking too much. But when I paused to catch my breath, I saw something at the tree line again. Not the stump this time, but what looked like fabric. Dark, torn cloth hanging from a low branch. I walked over and pulled it free. It was old, frayed, and stiff with what looked like dried dirt. Or maybe something else. I dropped it and backed away. That evening, I built the fire higher than usual, almost hoping the smoke would drive off whatever kept circling. But the fire only made the shadows jump harder against the cabin walls. That night was worse than all the others. The steps came earlier, before midnight, steady and circling. Then they stopped. For a long time, I thought maybe whoever, or whatever, had gone. But then I heard it, soft, steady, from the window behind the couch. Breathing. Slow, controlled, close enough to fog the glass if I dared to look. I couldn't bring myself to move. I sat on the bed with every muscle tight, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, I stayed awake until the sky turned pale. By then, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, barely eating, and carried them to the car. But when I tried the engine, it didn't turn over. The battery light flickered, then died. I checked under the hood, but nothing looked wrong. It was as if the car had been drained while it sat. Panic set in sharp and cold. I was stranded miles from anyone, with no signal, no way to call for help. My only option was to hike out to the road and follow it until I found someone. But that meant leaving the cabin behind, and everything in me screamed that something waited just beyond the tree line. Still, I couldn't stay. I shouldered my pack, tightened the straps, and started down the gravel road. The forest pressed close, silent as ever, but I forced myself forward step after step. The road twisted and stretched, and the silence made it feel endless. After maybe 2 miles, I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the dirt at the side of the road, there were footprints, bare feet wide, pressed deep as if heavy weight had made them. They weren't fresh, but they weren't washed out either. They followed the road ahead of me, too many to count, some overlapping. I froze, heart pounding, because the size of them varied. Some were small, almost childlike. Others were huge. I don't know how long I stood there before moving again. I forced myself to keep walking, eyes darting to the trees, expecting movement. The prints led farther down the road, and though I never saw anyone, the hair on my neck wouldn't lie flat. It took me hours, but finally the trees began to thin, the light widening, and in the distance I saw a truck parked at the edge of the road. Relief surged through me so hard I nearly collapsed. When I reached it, I pounded on the door until a man stepped out, startled, looking me over like I was a wild animal. I didn't explain much, just asked for a ride back to town. From there I found a way home, leaving the cabin, the woods, and everything behind me. I never went back for my car. The rental company told me they couldn't find it when they went to tow it out, like it had never been there. I didn't argue. I didn't want to know. Even now, in my own bed in a city full of noise, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and hold still, listening. The silence feels too heavy, too deep, and sometimes just before sleep takes me again, I swear I hear it. Slow, dragging steps in the leaves, circling, waiting. I had been looking for a quiet place to escape for a while. The noise of the city, the constant pressure from work, the endless routine of days blending into nights had left me drained. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you only find when you step far away from traffic lights and crowded streets. I found a small cabin listed online, deep in a wooded area that was several hours outside the nearest town. It wasn't expensive, which should have been my first warning sign, but I didn't care. The photo showed a small wooden structure with a porch, a roof that looked like it had been patched more than once, and a single window on the front. It looked old but livable. I booked it without thinking twice. The drive there was long, and the further I went, the more the road narrowed until it was nothing but a cracked strip of asphalt winding through endless trees. The forest looked heavy, as if the branches themselves leaned over the road to watch who dared pass. The late afternoon sun cut through in slanted beams, but most of the forest floor was already drowned in shadow. I had no cell service by the time I got close. The last turn led me down a gravel path that rattled my car so badly I thought my tires would pop. Then I saw it. The cabin standing by itself in a small clearing, as if someone had carved out just enough land for it and nothing else. The place looked even older than the photos had suggested. The wood was darker, probably soaked with years of weather, and the porch sagged a little in the middle. There was no sign of another house, no power lines, no cars, nothing. Just the cabin and the woods pressing in from every side. I killed the engine, stepped out, and the silence hit me hard. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no wind moving through leaves, nothing. I stood there with my bag in my hand, staring at the trees, and I felt uneasy for reasons I couldn't name. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed against the wall. The floor creaked under my weight. There was an old fireplace made of stone, and a stack of wood was piled beside it. The air smelled like dust and something faintly sour, like damp wood. The window at the front gave me a view of the porch and the trees beyond, but the glass was streaked and cloudy. There was no bathroom inside, just a bucket tucked in the corner that made me realize I'd be stepping outside for anything else. That didn't bother me at first. I had come here for quiet, and quiet was exactly what I had found. The first couple of hours were almost peaceful. I unpacked a few things, set up my sleeping bag on the bed since the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in years, and started a small fire in the fireplace to fight off the chill. By the time the sun started dipping, the cabin was filled with the warm crackle of burning wood. I sat at the table eating a sandwich I had brought with me, staring out the window as the forest grew darker and darker. The sky turned purple, then black, and that was when I realized how truly alone I was. No faint glow of city lights in the distance, no passing cars, not even a star above since the canopy of trees covered the sky. It was a darkness so complete it pressed against the glass like a weight. I tried to sleep early, but the silence kept me awake. Every small sound in the cabin became loud. The creak of the wood settling. The faint drip of water from somewhere I couldn't place. Even my own breathing sounded strange. Too heavy. Too slow. I rolled over again and again, staring at the faint outline of the rafters above me, until finally I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, though I couldn't remember what had pulled me from sleep. For a moment I lay there, not moving, just listening. Then I heard it. A sound from outside. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It was the crunch of gravel, the kind of sound you'd hear if someone stepped onto the path. I held my breath, straining my ears. Another crunch, closer this time, followed by the faintest sound of wood groaning, as if the porch had taken some weight. I sat up slowly, the blankets sliding off me. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. I told myself it could have been anything, a branch falling, an animal, even my imagination. But then there was another sound, and it wasn't one I could dismiss. A slow drag, like something rough sliding against the wood of the porch. My skin prickled. The fire had gone out, leaving the cabin in near total darkness except for the thin band of moonlight through the window. I tried to look out, but all I saw was the distorted reflection of the room in the glass. I stayed still for what felt like hours, my muscles aching until the silence returned. Eventually, I told myself I was being stupid, that I had just been half dreaming. I lay back down, though it took me forever to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The porch had a thin layer of dirt and leaves across it, and at first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But then I noticed the marks. They weren't footprints exactly, but places where the dirt had been disturbed, dragged, long, uneven streaks leading from the steps toward the edge of the trees. I crouched down, staring at them, trying to make sense of the pattern. It wasn't an animal. Animals left prints, paws, hooves. These looked like something heavy had been pulled or someone had shuffled in a strange way. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. I stood up quickly, went back inside, and locked the door. All day I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood, cleaning the cabin a little, walking the edge of the clearing, but my eyes kept drifting to the tree line. The woods were dense, almost too dense, with the trunks pressed close together and shadows filling every gap. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness, though I never saw anything move. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go further than a few steps into the trees. The air felt heavier there, like something pressed down on me the moment I crossed the edge. That night I tried to sleep again, but sleep didn't come easy. The forest outside remained deathly silent, and that silence became unbearable. I found myself wishing for even the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, anything. Instead, I lay in the dark, wide awake, every nerve in my body waiting for a sound. When it finally came, I nearly jumped out of my skin. A soft scrape against the wall of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like fingers dragging across the wood. I froze, staring at the black window. Then another scrape, this time on the other side. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving around me. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of a kitchen knife I had taken from the counter. By morning I was exhausted, my eyes burning. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the first thing I saw were fresh marks in the dirt near the wall. Long streaks, shallow but clear. Something or someone had circled the cabin. I had been planning a short trip for weeks, something away from the city, away from noise, away from work that never seemed to stop following me. A coworker had told me about a cabin he once rented deep in the woods near a lake, a place so quiet that the only sounds at night were the wind in the trees and the distant rush of water. It sounded perfect. The cabin wasn't listed online anymore, but after some digging, I found the owner's number and called him.
He told me it was still standing, still available, but he didn't really advertise it now.
He gave me directions that were more like vague instructions than clear roads, but he promised I'd find it if I followed carefully. I set off on a Friday morning in early fall, the air already cooler, leaves turning orange and red across the hills. The drive out of the city felt like shedding skin, each mile quieter than the last. After 2 hours on highways, I turned onto smaller roads, then dirt ones. The further I drove, the less certain I became that anyone ever really came this way. Trees leaned over the road. branches scraping the roof of my car, the path narrowing until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of leaves. I passed no houses, no signs, no other cars. It was just me, the road, and a gnawing sense that I was going deeper into nowhere. The air smelled of damp earth, and the road was scattered with fallen leaves that swirled behind me as I drove. The cabin appeared almost suddenly, tucked back from the road at the edge of a clearing. It was old, logs dark with age, roof patched in places with mismatched shingles. A narrow porch stretched across the front, and the windows were dusty, reflecting only faint light. It looked smaller than I had imagined, and for a moment I wondered if it was safe to stay in. But I reminded myself that this was what I had wanted. Quiet, simple, away from everything. I parked beside it, gravel crunching under the tires, and climbed out. The air here was still. No hum of cars, no chatter of people, only the rustle of leaves and the distant creak of trees shifting in the breeze. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had mailed me, the old lock stiff, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. The interior was bare but functional. A single main room with a stone fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. A short hallway led to a bathroom, and a small kitchenette stood near the window. Everything was worn but solid. Dust lingered in the corners and cobwebs clung to the rafters above. I set down my bag, unpacked only what I needed, and checked the cupboards. There were a few old pans, some mismatched cups and plates, and nothing else. I had brought enough food for the weekend, but the emptiness of the shelves made the cabin feel abandoned, like it hadn't been lived in for years. Outside, the clearing stretched into a slope that led down to the lake. I walked down with a bottle of water in hand. The lake was larger than I expected, surface still and glassy, reflecting the trees that crowded its edges. It was beautiful, untouched and silent in a way that pressed on my ears. I sat by the shore for a while, letting the quiet settle over me. But as much as I told myself this was peace, there was something heavy in it. It wasn't the easy calm of a park or the countryside. It was a silence that felt watchful, as if the woods were waiting for something. That night I lit a fire in the fireplace. The crackle of the wood was a relief, breaking the silence, giving the room a sense of life. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate at the table, and read a book I had brought. Hours passed slowly. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not even a bar. I hadn't expected much, but the complete lack of connection left me uneasy. Before bed, I stepped outside. The clearing was swallowed in darkness, trees looming like walls. The stars were sharp above, but the woods were too thick to let much sky show. The air was colder, damp, and my breath came out in faint white clouds. I stood for a minute listening. No insects, no birds, nothing. The woods were dead silent. I went back inside, locked the door, and got into bed. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, but I eventually drifted off. Sometime in the night I woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was almost completely dark. Then I heard it, a sound outside. A crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking in the clearing. I lay still, heart pounding, ears straining. The steps were uneven, sometimes close, sometimes further. They circled the cabin. The wood creaked as weight shifted on the porch boards. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed frozen until exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. In the morning, I forced myself outside. The clearing looked unchanged, the ground covered in fallen leaves. But near the porch I saw them, prints, not animal. Shoes. Someone had been walking in the night right outside the cabin. I told myself it could have been an old trail, maybe from the owner, but the leaves were fresh, not disturbed long ago. Someone had been there while I slept. I tried to shake it off. I made breakfast, walked down to the lake, and even took the trail along its edge. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often I thought I heard something, a snap of a twig, a shift of branches, but when I looked back, there was nothing. That second night I built the fire higher, trying to make the cabin brighter, warmer. But when I finally turned in, the same thing happened. Hours into sleep, I woke to footsteps outside. This time slower, closer. The boards of the porch groaned again. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Not once, not twice. Slowly, carefully, someone was testing it. The lock held, but my throat tightened. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the heavy flashlight from my bag. By morning, I was shaking with exhaustion. I wanted to leave, but the road back was long, and I told myself it might just be hunters or kids from somewhere nearby. But deep down, I knew better. That day, I kept busy, gathering wood, cleaning the cabin, walking the trail again. But every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods felt too still, too empty. That night was worse, much worse. I hadn't been asleep long when I woke to a sound not outside, but inside. A floorboard creaking. Someone was in the cabin. My chest tightened. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, faint, deliberate, from the far side of the room. I couldn't see in the dark, but I felt it. Someone standing there, waiting. I gripped the flashlight, snapped it on, and shone it across the room. Nothing. Just the table, the chairs, the fireplace. But the door was wide open. The cold air poured in, and I knew then that whoever had been outside was now inside, or had been, maybe still was. I slammed the door shut, locked it again, and sat in the corner with the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind outside kept me on edge. I didn't sleep. By morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag fast, heart racing, eyes darting to the windows. I opened the door and the clearing looked just as before, but I saw it. In the dirt near the car, footprints, fresh, leading away into the woods. I didn't care who it was or why. I only knew I couldn't stay another night. I drove out fast, tires skidding on the leaves, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The road seemed longer this time, endless, and every shadow between the trees felt like it hid someone watching. When I finally reached the highway, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in days. The world returned, cars, gas stations, people. But the silence of those woods stayed with me, heavy, pressing. I never went back for the deposit. Never called the owner. And I never told anyone the full truth of what I saw, or what I heard, because I knew if I did, they'd just tell me it was nothing. Just nerves, just the woods. But I know what I heard. I know someone was there, and I know if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I had been driving for hours when I finally reached the turnoff. A narrow dirt road that cut through tall pines and sloped into the deep hills. My hands were stiff from the steering wheel. My legs cramped, and the thought of being away from people for a while was the only thing pushing me forward. I had rented a small cabin through a listing that barely had pictures, just a vague description about being remote and perfect for solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. A place where I could be alone, where no one could bother me, where I could hear myself think. The road twisted and narrowed until my tires crackled over rocks and broken branches. There was no signal on my phone by the time I reached a clearing. The cabin stood there, smaller than I expected, with dark wood walls, a metal roof streaked with rust, and one small porch. It looked old but solid, the kind of place hunters might use in the off-season. Around it, the forest pressed in tight. The trees seemed to lean closer the longer I looked, their branches clawing at the fading sky. I killed the engine and sat in silence. The sound of the motor faded and the quiet settled heavy around me, thick and almost uncomfortable. When I stepped out, the air was colder than I thought it would be. It smelled of pine sap, damp leaves, and the faint musk of wet soil. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees and the distant call of a bird. The cabin door creaked when I pulled it open. Inside, it was darker than I expected, with only a small square window letting in light. Dust floated in the air. There was a single wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against the wall, and a shelf with a few rusted cans of food. The floorboards groaned under my boots as if the place hadn't been stepped in for years. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter and it would do. I set my bags on the table and walked the perimeter. There was no electricity, just an old lantern with half an inch of kerosene at the bottom. No running water, only a rusty sink basin that led to nothing. A wood stove sat in one corner with a pile of chopped logs stacked neatly beside it. Though the wood looked old, the ends gray and soft from time. Whoever had left it there hadn't been back for a long while. I found a water barrel behind the cabin, half full, the surface covered in a film of dead leaves and drowned insects. I skimmed it off with a stick and told myself I could boil it if I needed to. By the time I had unpacked, the light outside had dimmed. The forest swallowed the horizon faster than it should have. Night seemed to fall heavier here, as if the trees themselves were pushing the dark down faster. I lit the lantern, its glow barely cutting the shadows, and sat at the table. The silence was enormous. At home, even in the countryside, there was always some faint hum. A car far away, a plane overhead, a dog barking down the road. Here, there was nothing. Just the faint creak of the wood stove expanding as it cooled, and the occasional snap of a branch outside. I thought the silence would be peaceful, but after only an hour, I found myself restless. Every sound outside pulled my attention. I kept glancing at the window where only a black square looked back at me. The lantern made the glass reflect my own face, so I couldn't see anything beyond it. I moved the lantern away, but then the cabin felt darker, as if the shadow stretched longer, so I brought it back. I couldn't find the right balance. I told myself it was only the first night and I would settle in by morning. I tried to sleep on the cot, but the mattress sagged so low in the middle that my spine bowed uncomfortably. The sheets smelled faintly of mildew. I lay awake listening. The forest wasn't silent anymore. I heard movement outside, faint and deliberate, not the random shuffle of animals. Something brushed against the side of the cabin, soft but steady, like a hand dragging across the wall. My chest tightened as I held my breath. It stopped, then shifted to the back of the cabin, the wood creaking as if weight leaned against it. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I swore whatever was outside could hear it. I didn't move. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, the sound faded. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I opened my eyes again, weak daylight was slipping through the window. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. My boots sank into the soft soil and damp grass clung to my ankles. The air was sharp with cold. I circled slowly, scanning the dirt for tracks, but all I saw were scattered pine needles and old leaves. Still, the ground looked disturbed in places, as though something had pressed down lightly and then pulled away. I couldn't be sure if it was animal or human. I told myself animals often came close to human shelters in the woods, sniffing around for scraps. It didn't have to mean anything. Still, I felt watched as I stood there, the back of my neck prickling. The trees swayed slightly, though the air was still. I decided to hike deeper into the woods, partly to clear my head, partly to see if there were any trails or signs of other cabins. I packed water and a granola bar and set out. The ground was uneven, full of roots and rocks hidden under moss. I moved slowly, marking my path with broken branches so I wouldn't get lost. After an hour, I reached a ridge that looked down over a stretch of valley. From there, the forest rolled endlessly in every direction. No roads, no rooftops, just endless green broken by shadows. It made me feel small, as if I were swallowed whole by the land. I chewed the granola bar and told myself this was exactly what I came for. No people, no noise, just isolation. Still, the unease from the night before didn't leave me. When I finally turned back, I felt a faint pressure in my chest, like I was moving too slow, like something wanted me to hurry. That night, I built a small fire in the stove and boiled water from the barrel. The flames flickered against the metal, casting light across the walls. The heat was comforting, but outside the forest pressed closer. I ate a can of beans I had brought, the taste metallic but filling. As I cleaned the tin, I heard a sound from the trees. A crack, followed by a shuffle, then stillness. My hand froze. It came again, closer this time, a slow crunch of leaves underfoot. I blew out the lantern and sat in the dark, only the stove glowing faint orange. I strained my ears. The steps came closer, circling the cabin slowly, stopping and starting. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The steps stopped at the back wall. Then faintly there was a sound, scraping like a nail dragging along the wood. It slid across, then stopped. My skin crawled. I stayed still, my hand on the stove poker, the only weapon I had. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound occasionally starting again in different spots. Then silence. The forest swallowed it whole. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I finally opened the door. The cold air slapped my face. I walked to the back wall where the sound had been. At first I saw nothing. Then I leaned closer. Thin marks were carved into the wood, shallow but long, as if someone had deliberately scraped along it with something sharp. The lines were too high for an animal. They ran straight, slow, purposeful. My stomach twisted. Someone had been outside. Someone had been circling. I thought of leaving that day. I could pack my things, drive back down the dirt road, and forget about this place. But the road was long, and part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the marks had been there before I arrived. Maybe the sounds were just branches against the wall carried by the wind. If I left now, it would feel like running from nothing. I decided to stay one more night to see if it happened again, to prove to myself it was all in my head. That night I kept the lantern burning and sat at the table with the stove poker across my lap. Hours crawled by. The forest outside was restless. Branches snapped far off, then closer. I heard movement, soft but deliberate, circling again. The marks had been real. My mouth dried as I sat there, forcing myself not to breathe too loud. Then faintly I heard the crunch of footsteps on the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. My body froze. The sound stopped just outside the door. I stared at it, waiting for the knob to turn, for something to push against it. But nothing came. Just silence. Minutes passed. Finally the steps retreated. Slow, steady, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep again. At dawn I packed. I couldn't stay. My body was stiff with exhaustion, my mind stretched thin. I loaded my bags, shoved them into the car, and climbed behind the wheel. The dirt road seemed narrower than before, the trees leaning in closer as if trying to keep me from leaving. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I drove without looking back at the cabin. When I finally reached the paved road miles later, I pulled over and sat in silence. My whole body trembled. The cabin had been empty, but I knew someone had been out there. Someone had circled it, scraped its walls, stood on the porch. They never tried to break in, never said a word, but they were there, watching, waiting. I'll never know who or why. All I know is that I left, and I will never go back to a cabin alone again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. My plan was simple. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, leave behind the crowded streets, the constant horns, the late nights filled with restless sleep. I wanted silence. A cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect escape, far from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and the sound of wind. I rented a small place that I found listed through a private owner. The pictures showed a one-room log cabin with a front porch, a small fireplace, and a path that disappeared into deep woods behind it. When I first pulled up, I noticed how quiet it was. The road I had driven on was little more than gravel pressed down into the dirt. My tires crunched as I slowed near the clearing where the cabin stood. The trees crowded in close, their trunks thick and dark, the canopy overhead blotting out much of the afternoon light. The cabin itself was older than it looked in the photos. The wood was weathered gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. There was no one around, just the constant buzz of insects and the occasional call of a bird. I unloaded my bags from the car and carried them inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly sour like damp earth. There was one small bed pushed against the wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow counter where an old propane stove sat. The window glass was wavy and streaked, and the curtains were thin enough that I could see right through them. It wasn't cozy the way I had pictured it, but it was private, and that was enough for me. I set down my things and stepped outside again. The clearing was only about 20 feet across, surrounded by trees so dense I couldn't see more than a few yards into them. The path that ran behind the cabin was narrow, the dirt hard-packed from years of use. It wound down into the woods until it vanished between thick trunks. I stared at it longer than I meant to, the way it seemed to invite me in as though it was waiting. Something about it made me uneasy. I shook off the feeling and went back inside. I unpacked slowly, laying out food on the counter and pulling out the few books I had brought. As evening settled in, I lit the old oil lamp that sat on the table. The flame flickered weakly, throwing long shadows against the walls. The woods outside grew darker, and soon the cabin felt like the only thing left in the world. A small island of weak light in the middle of an ocean of black trees. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was thin and the springs creaked every time I shifted. The silence I had wanted so badly pressed in on me. Not peaceful the way I had imagined, but heavy, almost suffocating. Every sound outside seemed louder in the quiet. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They came from the direction of the path, moving closer to the cabin. I held my breath and stared at the ceiling, waiting. After a long stretch of silence, I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke stiff and tired. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside with the mug in hand. The air was damp and cool. The path behind the cabin caught my eye again. I walked toward it this time, standing at its edge. The dirt was pressed flat by many footprints, though I couldn't tell how old they were. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. They stretched both ways, some leading deeper into the woods, others toward the clearing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe hunters used the trail, maybe locals hiked through here, but the prints looked fresh. I backed away from the path and went inside. That day I tried to read, but I kept looking up at the windows, listening. I thought I heard something moving in the trees more than once, but when I looked, there was nothing there. In the afternoon, I decided to chop some firewood. I found an old axe leaned against the porch. Its blade was dull, but it still cut. I swung it into the logs until my arms ached, stacking the wood neatly by the cabin wall. The repetitive work calmed me for a while. As night fell again, the unease returned. I sat by the lamp, reading with one ear turned toward the woods. I tried to ignore the thought of the footprints. Tried not to think about the noise I had heard the night before. When I finally went to bed, I left the lamp burning low on the table. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching. My car sat just outside the cabin in the clearing. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps circling the car, slow and deliberate, as though someone was inspecting it. My chest tightened. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped. Then I heard the creak of the porch steps. One by one, the boards groaned under weight. Someone was outside the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tense. The door was locked, but it was only a simple latch. Nothing that would stop someone who really wanted in. I thought I heard a faint scrape against the wood near the window, then silence again. I didn't move for hours, my eyes fixed on the dim glow of the lamp. Finally, sometime near dawn, I drifted into a shallow sleep. In the morning, I forced myself to check outside. My car was as I had left it, but faint smudges of dirt streaked across the driver's side window, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass. My stomach knotted. I looked around the clearing, but there was nothing else, no sign of anyone. The woods were silent, the air still. I considered leaving that day, but I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably kids messing around. Maybe someone local saw the car and decided to spook me. I tried to convince myself of that, but it didn't feel right. The cabin was too far out for kids to wander to. Whoever it was, they had come down that path on purpose. I kept busy during the day, walking around the clearing, checking the tree line, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in close. Sometimes I thought I saw movement deep between the trunks. A flicker of something pale, but when I looked harder, there was nothing. That night, I barricaded the door with the table. I pulled the curtains tight, even though they barely covered the glass. I lay in bed with the axe leaned against the wall within reach. Hours passed in silence. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again. Footsteps on the gravel. Slow, careful, circling the cabin this time. I held my breath as they stopped just outside my window. The curtain moved slightly, as though touched from the other side. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped the handle of the axe but didn't move. The curtain swayed again, then stilled. I waited, every second stretching forever. Finally, the steps moved away, fading into the woods. When morning came, I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching, waiting. I packed my bags quickly, shoving everything into the car. As I loaded the last of it, I glanced toward the path. For the first time, I saw clear footprints leading from the trees straight to the cabin, circling it, then disappearing back into the woods, fresh pressed deep into the dirt. I got in the car and started it. The sound was loud in the stillness. As I turned to leave the clearing, I looked in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, where the shadows were thickest, a figure stood. I couldn't make out details, only the shape. Tall, still, watching. I drove fast, the gravel spitting from my tires. I didn't slow until I reached the main road miles away. My hand shook on the wheel and I kept looking in the mirror even though I knew no one was behind me. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The sound of the footsteps, the handprint on the glass, the curtain shifting. Whoever it was, they never tried to break in. They never spoke. They only watched. I wondered how long they had been using that path, how many times they had stood outside the cabin before I arrived, waiting in the dark. I never went back. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night certain that I hear the sound of slow footsteps in gravel, circling, waiting. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe months if I counted the way it started forming in my head. I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city, the endless voices, the rush of cars, the sirens at night that kept me awake. I found a listing online for a small cabin deep in the woods of northern country. It wasn't advertised as a luxury place, not even close. It was bare bones. A one-room structure with an old fireplace, a cot, and a small kitchenette powered by a propane tank. There was no cell service and no electricity. The owner said in the ad that it was meant for hunters or people who wanted real quiet. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The drive out there was long. The paved road turned into gravel after a few hours, then into dirt, narrow and uneven. Pines stood tall on both sides, their tops blotting out much of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the less I felt like I was part of the world I had known. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I cut the engine and just sat there staring. The cabin was small, gray wood darkened by weather and age. The roof sagged a little in the middle. It looked like something built decades ago, not touched since except to keep it barely standing. I unpacked slowly, setting my gear inside. There wasn't much. A sleeping bag, a lantern, some cans of food, and a backpack with clothes. I had a knife I always carried when camping, nothing big, just a utility blade and a small hatchet for wood. The first thing I noticed once I was settled inside was how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own pulse. At first, that quiet felt like what I had come for. I sat on the small porch, breathing the pine-scented air, watching the light fade through the trees. But as night settled in, the quiet began to feel different. Not calm, but heavy, as if something else was listening too. The first night I struggled to sleep. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside made me sit up in the cot, straining to hear. At one point, in the middle of the night, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the dry needles outside. Not an animal padding softly, but something heavier, deliberate. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe the old wood of the cabin cooling and shifting. But my body wouldn't relax. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams until morning light finally seeped in. By the second day, I forced myself to push aside the unease. I hiked through the woods, trying to map the area in my head. There was a small creek not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I filled my canteen there and washed my face. The forest was dense, and I noticed how easy it would be to lose my way if I wandered too far without marking trees. I kept glancing back, making sure I could still see some landmark that told me the direction of the cabin. That night, the sounds came again. I had eaten a small meal of beans and bread, then sat by the fire until it burned low. The forest outside was dark, darker than I expected, even with the moon overhead. When I finally lay down, it wasn't long before I heard the crunching again, slow steps in the distance. They circled, sometimes close, sometimes further away. I didn't move, I just held still and listened. There was no mistaking it now. Something or someone was out there. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the pattern of the steps wasn't random. They paused, shifted, continued. They moved with intent. I kept my knife beside me, my hand resting on it, even as exhaustion eventually pulled me into an uneasy sleep. On the third day, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the creek, a patch of ground had been disturbed. The soil looked freshly turned, as if something had been dug up or buried. No animal tracks around it, no sign of tools, but the dirt was loose and darker than the rest. I crouched there for a long time, staring, trying to make sense of it. A grave-sized patch, too neat for a random accident. I backed away, the hair on my arms standing up. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The wood seemed thicker, the air heavier. I tried to busy myself with chopping some firewood, but my swings were uneven, my mind elsewhere. When dusk came, I locked the cabin door, even though the latch was nothing more than a bent piece of metal that wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. That night was worse than the others. The footsteps came again, closer this time. They stopped right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my body frozen in the cot, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles hurt. The silence stretched. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of something brushing against the wall. A hand, a branch? I didn't move until hours later, when I noticed the faint gray light of dawn through the window. The next morning, I stepped outside to find footprints in the soft dirt. Human footprints, bare feet wide and flat, pressed deep as if the person had stood there a long time. They led around the cabin, circling it once before disappearing into the trees. My stomach turned over. Someone had been watching me, walking barefoot in the freezing night. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back down the road. But the path was rough and my car wasn't built for deep forest terrain. The thought of breaking down halfway out scared me even more. I told myself I'd just stay one more night, then leave early the next morning. That evening I built the fire higher, trying to push back the dark. I sat with my back against the cabin wall, staring into the trees. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Hours passed like that, my eyes burning from the strain of watching. Eventually, I dozed off, the fire crackling low. When I woke, it was to the sound of breathing, not mine. It was outside the window, slow, steady, close enough that the glass faintly fogged at the corners. I stayed perfectly still, my body screaming to move but refusing to obey. The breathing lasted minutes, maybe longer. Then slowly it drifted away. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was light, I gathered my things and stuffed them into the backpack. I stepped outside, nerves raw, scanning every direction. That's when I saw it. On the porch, right by the door, lay a dead rabbit. Its neck twisted, body torn open. Blood soaked the wood. It hadn't been eaten, just killed and left there. I didn't hesitate any longer. I hauled my gear into the car, my hands shaking, and started down the dirt road. The forest pressed in on both sides, the tires sliding on loose gravel. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking down the middle of the road behind me. My heart didn't slow until I saw the first sign of pavement miles later. I never went back for the deposit I had paid on that cabin. I never called the owner, never asked who else might have been in those woods. All I know is that someone was there, someone who watched me, circled me, and left signs I was never meant to miss. And the worst part wasn't the footsteps or the breathing. It was the thought that if I had stayed one more night, the rabbit on the porch might not have been an animal. It might have been me. I never liked the way the woods went silent at night. During the day, the forest had its own rhythm. Wind pushing through the trees, the sound of branches creaking, birds calling to one another, the faint rush of a stream somewhere in the distance. But when the sun slipped behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long and deep, the silence came down heavy, almost like a weight pressing on my chest. That silence was all I could think about when I pulled up to the cabin. It sat deep in the woods, the kind of place people built decades ago as a hunting camp, left to rot, then patched back together by someone who thought it might make a decent weekend getaway. The roof sagged a little in the middle, the boards on the porch were warped, and the paint on the door had peeled until it looked like dried bark. The gravel road I had driven in on ended right in front of the cabin, and there was nothing else. No neighbors, no lights, just trees as far as I could see. I had rented it online. The pictures made it seem nicer than it was. They had been taken in bright summer sunlight, when the grass was green and the trees full. Now it was late autumn and the forest felt empty and brittle. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the ones left on the ground crunched under my boots as I hauled my bag up to the porch. The cabin was supposed to be a place to get away from work, from noise, from people. A week alone in the woods, no phone service, no internet, just me, some books, and the sound of the fire at night. At least that was the idea. Inside it smelled of dust and old wood. The living room was small, with a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A couch sagged in the middle and a wooden chair leaned against the wall. The kitchen had a rusty sink, a small table with one chair, and a gas stove that looked older than me. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a set of drawers missing two handles. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime like no one had bothered to clean in months. Still, I told myself it would do. I dropped my bag on the bed, checked the little bathroom, just a toilet, a sink, and a cracked mirror, and stepped back outside to bring in some firewood. There was a stack of it by the shed, split and ready. I carried a load to the porch, trying not to think about how quickly the shadows were spreading through the trees. By the time the sun dipped below the ridge, I had a fire going. The crackle of flames was the only sound, and for a moment it was almost comforting. I ate a can of soup I heated on the stove, then sat in the chair by the fire until my eyes grew heavy. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire. I thought about how dark it must be outside, how thick the woods were, and how far the next person might be. I locked the door, slid the bolt across, and crawled into bed. The mattress sagged and the blanket smelled faintly of mildew. I left the lamp on, its yellow glow filling the room, and listened. At first it was quiet. Then I began to notice small things. A creak as the cabin settled, the wind brushing against the roof, something shifting in the leaves outside. I told myself it was just animals, a raccoon, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Still, I pulled the blanket tighter and tried to sleep. I woke sometime in the night. The fire had burned down to coals and the room was cold. The lamp was still on, throwing weak light across the walls. I didn't know why I had woken up, but I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening. That's when I heard it. It was faint, but it was there. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate crunching over the leaves. My breath caught. I waited, straining to hear. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, then stopped. I could picture someone standing just outside the wall, inches away from me, listening the same way I was. I stayed frozen. Minutes passed. Finally, the sound started again, moving toward the back of the cabin. I thought about getting up, about peeking out the window, but fear pinned me to the bed. After a while, the sound faded. I told myself it was an animal again, something heavier than I expected, and that my mind was making it into more. Eventually, I drifted back into a restless sleep. In the morning, the world looked normal again. Pale light streamed through the trees. The frost glistened on the grass, and birds had returned to the branches. I stepped outside, trying to convince myself I had imagined the footsteps. But then I saw them, tracks in the dirt by the side of the cabin. Not animal tracks, shoes. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, then continuing around to the back. My stomach tightened. Someone had been there. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but pride or stubbornness held me back. Maybe it was just a hiker who had stumbled onto the cabin. Maybe a hunter. The woods weren't mine after all. Still, the idea of someone standing at my window in the middle of the night made me uneasy. The rest of the day passed slowly. I chopped some wood, read for a while, and tried to keep busy. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, still in silence, staring back at me. That night, I built the fire bigger and double-checked the lock on the door. I even wedged a chair under the knob. I left the lamp on again and lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting for the silence to settle in. It came, just like before, heavy, suffocating. And then, after what felt like hours, the sound returned. Footsteps. This time they were closer, slower. I sat up, holding my breath. The steps circled the cabin, pausing now and then. At one point, I swore I heard someone touch the window pane, the faint tap of a finger against glass. My chest felt tight. I wanted to shout to scare whoever it was away, but the sound died in my throat. The steps lingered at the front door. I could hear the boards of the porch creak under the weight. The knob rattled just once, testing the lock. I gripped the blanket with white knuckles, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, the sound faded again. Whoever it was melted back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I staggered outside, my legs shaking. More footprints, fresh in the frost. Clearer this time. Someone had been on the porch. Someone had tried the door. I couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. They knew I was alone. And they were coming back. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe months if I counted the way it started forming in my head. I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city. The endless voices, the rush of cars, the sirens at night that kept me awake. I found a listing online for a small cabin, deep in the woods of northern country. It wasn't advertised as a luxury place, not even close. It was bare bones. A one-room structure with an old fireplace, a cot, and a small kitchenette powered by a propane tank. There was no cell service and no electricity. The owner said in the ad that it was meant for hunters or people who wanted real quiet. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The drive out there was long. The paved road turned into gravel after a few hours, then into dirt, narrow and uneven. Pines stood tall on both sides, their tops blotting out much of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the less I felt like I was part of the world I had known. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I cut the engine and just sat there, staring. The cabin was small, gray wood darkened by weather and age. The roof sagged a little in the middle. It looked like something built decades ago, not touched since except to keep it barely standing. I unpacked slowly, setting my gear inside. There wasn't much, a sleeping bag, a lantern, some cans of food, and a backpack with clothes. I had a knife I always carried when camping, nothing big, just a utility blade and a small hatchet for wood. The first thing I noticed once I was settled inside was how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own pulse. At first, that quiet felt like what I had come for. I sat on the small porch breathing the pine-scented air, watching the light fade through the trees. But as night settled in, the quiet began to feel different. Not calm, but heavy, as if something else was listening too. The first night I struggled to sleep. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside made me sit up in the cot, straining to hear. At one point in the middle of the night, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the dry needles outside. Not an animal padding softly, but something heavier, deliberate. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe the old wood of the cabin cooling and shifting. But my body wouldn't relax. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams until morning light finally seeped in. By the second day, I forced myself to push aside the unease. I hiked through the woods trying to map the area in my head. There was a small creek not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold. I filled my canteen there and washed my face. The forest was dense, and I noticed how easy it would be to lose my way if I wandered too far without marking trees. I kept glancing back, making sure I could still see some landmark that told me the direction of the cabin. That night, the sounds came again. I had eaten a small meal of beans and bread, then sat by the fire until it burned low. The forest outside was dark, darker than I expected even with the moon overhead. When I finally lay down, it wasn't long before I heard the crunching again. Slow steps in the distance. They circled, sometimes close, sometimes further away. I didn't move, I just held still and listened. There was no mistaking it now. Something or someone was out there. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the pattern of the steps wasn't random. They paused, shifted, continued. They moved with intent. I kept my knife beside me, my hand resting on it even as exhaustion eventually pulled me into an uneasy sleep. On the third day, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the creek, a patch of ground had been disturbed. The soil looked freshly turned, as if something had been dug up or buried. No animal tracks around it, no sign of tools, but the dirt was loose and darker than the rest. I crouched there for a long time, staring, trying to make sense of it. A grave-sized patch too neat for a random accident. I backed away, the hair on my arm standing up. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The wood seemed thicker, the air heavier. I tried to busy myself with chopping some firewood, but my swings were uneven, my mind elsewhere. When dusk came, I locked the cabin door, even though the latch was nothing more than a bent piece of metal that wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. That night was worse than the others. The footsteps came again, closer this time. They stopped right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my body frozen in the cot, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles hurt. The silence stretched. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of something brushing against the wall. A hand, a branch. I didn't move until hours later, when I noticed the faint gray light of dawn through the window. The next morning, I stepped outside to find footprints in the soft dirt. Human footprints, bare feet, wide and flat, pressed deep as if the person had stood there a long time. They led around the cabin, circling it once before disappearing into the trees. My stomach turned over. Someone had been watching me, walking barefoot in the freezing night. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back down the road. But the path was rough and my car wasn't built for deep forest terrain. The thought of breaking down halfway out scared me even more. I told myself I'd just stay one more night, then leave early the next morning. That evening, I built the fire higher, trying to push back the dark. I sat with my back against the cabin wall, staring into the trees. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Hours passed like that, my eyes burning from the strain of watching. Eventually, I dozed off, the fire crackling low. When I woke, it was to the sound of breathing, not mine. It was outside the window, slow, steady, close enough that the glass faintly fogged at the corners. I stayed perfectly still, my body screaming to move but refusing to obey. The breathing lasted minutes, maybe longer, then slowly it drifted away. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was light, I gathered my things and stuffed them into the backpack. I stepped outside, nerves raw, scanning every direction. That's when I saw it. On the porch, right by the door, lay a dead rabbit. Its neck twisted, body torn open. Blood soaked the wood. It hadn't been eaten, just killed and left there. I didn't hesitate any longer. I hauled my gear into the car, my hands shaking, and started down the dirt road. The forest pressed in on both sides, the tires sliding on loose gravel. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking down the middle of the road behind me. My heart didn't slow until I saw the first sign of pavement miles later. I never went back for the deposit I had paid on that cabin. I never called the owner, never asked who else might have been in those woods. All I know is that someone was there, someone who watched me, circled me, and left signs I was never meant to miss. And the worst part wasn't the footsteps or the breathing. It was the thought that if I had stayed one more night, the rabbit on the porch might not have been an animal. It might have been me.